I have been making YouTube videos for 5 years, and in just a couple months I will have been doing Trip Through Time specifically for 5 years as well. Which is a rather serendipitous time to reach the last hope, the end of Omen of the Stars. I started this series with the intention of tracking forgotten elements of the series, and seeing how they compounded over time into the network of lore, characters, and time periods we have now. And I have been doing that quite a bit. Being able to work in release order has given me the chance to pick up on things even I had forgotten, like the specific places where Super Editions released, and how not just their blatant tie-ins, but their lore is noticeably from a certain point in the main series. One thing I didn't expect when I started this journey was how much of my time and effort in these videos would end up focused on the illustrations. I've said before that art isn't exactly my favorite thing in the world. I never doodled in school, wasn't a fan of art classes, and still don't really ever draw for fun. But when I started Trip Through Time, I knew I wanted the format to be wildly different from my Spiels episodes, and that I wanted a chance to showcase the book's content more directly. Doing an illustration speed paint of a moment from the book I was covering was an easy solution, one I didn't put much thought into at the time. Since then, I have created 45 different illustrations, increasing in skill, complexity, and certainly effort. I know that the way I approach drawing these illustrations, and drawing in general, has radically changed as a result of these videos, but it's an aspect to them that I never really talk about as I drone on about the books. Today, that is going to change. I'd like to take you through an expedited version of the drawing journey I've been on in the background of this channel, and maybe even where I'd like to go from here. Let's begin where it all began, with Into the Wild. This is definitely an odd one for me to look back on, because the way I was approaching it is so different from anything I would do now. First of all, even the moment itself that I chose, of Longtail's fight against Rusty and pulling off his collar, is not an underrated moment at all. I actually hadn't decided at this point that I wanted to do underrated or obscure or forgotten moments from each book, and frankly I'd have a bit of trouble picking one out in Into the Wild because it's so popular and so widely known that just about everything in it is going to be popular with someone. But even if that wasn't the case, this is definitely not an illustration chosen based on the idea that they are underrated. The other big thing is my composition. I didn't really do a good enough sketch, I would say, going in to decide what exactly I was going to be drawing. And I went very much cat by cat. I didn't think about the composition of the whole piece, or certainly not the colors of the piece. And also, for some reason, didn't even lower the opacity of my sketch. It looks like it all. That's weird to look back on. Lionheart was also a character I hadn't designed at this point. I was designing him on the spot, and I didn't decide to do any mock-ups before I started drawing, so you can see me playing around with the design here. There's a lot of this that I would just never ever do today. The other thing you'll obviously notice is that the format of the speed paint is very different from what I do now. I was recording my entire screen all in one, and just trying to condense that down and cut out any sections that weren't actually part of the illustration. I don't even remember if I turned on Do Not Disturb for this. It's possible that you end up seeing notifications come up in the middle of the speed paint. I was very, very new to this, and other than learning how to record my screen in the first place, I did not do enough research into how this worked. The rocks also... A lot of these aren't even rocks, they're flat circles that seem to intrude on the spaces where other rocks should be. You can see them, like, coming into the bottoms of each other. It's just, And then you get to the actual background, and I was so exhausted at this point because I had spent the better part of a day on this silly little thing. So I was really, really fudging the background, and I had no specific plan for it. So I just put in some bushes, grass-ish. It doesn't even match the grass color of the rest of the illustration. I didn't blend it at all. And then, okay, here is one thing I will give myself. I went in with the shading of everything last, because I at least knew at this point that I wanted everything to have the same light source in the illustration, at the very least. But I didn't do a particularly good job, and I didn't actually map out in my head how the light source would be coming, so even though I tried, it is inconsistent across them. Now we have the redraw of that. Obviously, this was done years later. It's not the next chronologically that I did. But I had to put this one in here because it's the exact thing that I was looking for. It's the redraw of that exact piece. Here, you can see most of what I ended up doing to start with was figuring out the exact posing of the whole thing, planning out a composition from the start, and bringing in my portraits if I knew which cats were going to be here. Dappletail. I was going to say, I didn't think I included any cats I needed to mock up, but I definitely did. So Dappletail will be coming up soon, and I gave her some thrush pelt characteristics in her shape language, since I knew they were related. This is another thing I do, is the reason all of these cats are here in the first place is because I looked it up in the book and figured out which cats were in this scene. The other big thing that I fixed here that was really important to me, eventually, was, there we go, Rusty's paw markings, his posing up here against Longtail, because it was not good in the original, and it wasn't good in my original sketch here either. But what I did while I was sketching out those other cats whose poses I was more comfortable with was I reached out to my artist friends who are significantly more experienced than me, and I asked them for help on how to make this composition work. I also tried out a different style of tabby stripes, was more explicit about the shading I was using, and I made the whole thing very warm-colored, one hue overall, in order to give a dense, almost scary ambiance, because we're ultimately supposed to be focused on Rusty here, and how he is genuinely fearing for his life in this moment. Even so, though, there's a lot of stuff in this picture, it is about a year ago now, that I don't like as much as the composition of some of my recent ones. I still like it very much. I definitely prefer it to the original. Bluestar in particular, I'm very, very happy with. But I don't necessarily like how big some of the background characters are, and I do think that I ended up rushing some of the backmost elements in ways that I would probably change if I did it again. But I'm not doing it again. I'm done. I'm good. Anyway, it is a significant improvement, and I do like what I was able to come up with. There are a lot of things in this illustration that just are so much closer to what I have become than the original Into the Wild could ever be. Some people have asked if I'm going to replace the thumbnail for the Into the Wild video with this instead of the original. I'm not going to, because I think it would be a little disingenuous as to the contents of that video. It is one of my first videos, and the art reflects that. But if I did replace it, it wouldn't necessarily be as accurate. It feels a little clickbaity, just to me. You can also see here, as I'm doing the background, I still wish I had done it a little differently. And there are definitely some background techniques that I was only developing here. But I was being much more explicit about which colors I used with the background to try and match them to the characters. This is something I definitely improved on over the last year, so I'm glad to see it here. And we're back to the old days. Fire and Ice, March 2021. Oh boy. So, Fire and Ice, I may dislike this illustration more than I do the Into the Wild one, actually. I decided to do the time that Greystripe met Silverstream. I put zero research into what this moment was like, other than my knowledge that it was at the RiverClan border, and Firestar and Fireheart and Greystripe's apprentices were there. Silverstream's here. I didn't even check her expression. My goodness. That's not our sassy lady. And I put precisely 0 thought into the overall composition, which is why the illustration honestly looks really empty. You can also see I didn't really understand how my tools worked yet in Clip Studio. So I have a lot of cases where I'm just forcefully drawing in each and every one of the markings, or forcefully erasing the parts that I didn't actually want to include. And you have this enormous section of, like, almost black shading. Why would I do that? I knew at this point how colored shading worked, but I guess that was just too much for me today. Firestar's posing looks really, really awkward to me. It looks like his hip is disjointed. It's up against his neck. Yeah, it just... I think I was going for some sort of perspective on him, but I didn't plan it out or do it well. It was not good. Cinderpaw, at this point, still had her old design that I more or less slapped together based on wanting to make it look unique. But I ignored the wanting to make it look appealing in any conceivable way, which is kind of a problem. I don't like this old design. I really, really like her new one much, much better, but that one's just a product of the times. Brackenfur looks really wacky. Brackenpaw, sorry. His neck area is just something I had not quite figured out how to convey. Trying to draw any young cats at this point— oh, shoot. I moved his eyes up? I needed to move them down. Oh, no. Oh, yeah, so this is bad. I don't criticize my art for the sake of making fun of it or making you pity me, but being able to look back at your work from this long ago and instantly see all the issues you have with it, this massive empty space and the basic background, it helps. It really does help you to improve. Here we have Forest of Secrets, which honestly was a big improvement to me. It was the first time where I looked at my previous illustrations and went, ooh. And it was a bit of a wake-up call that I needed to change something. So, first of all, this was the first time where I actually chose an underrated moment. I looked through and I said, I'd like to bring up some of the softer elements in this book, the things that most people don't remember. Thornpaw and Brightpaw's apprenticeship ceremony is a very cute moment that I don't see talked about very often. And I think I chose better moments later on in this series, but this was a fine one. This was a fine one to start, and obviously I have a bias for my Thorn Boy. I attempted to do some perspective with Bluestar atop the high rock, looking down at the new apprentices and mentors. I wasn't really sure how to make the shading on that work, and the perspective of Brightpaw and Thornpaw are clearly very different from each other. Thornpaw's head looks detached from his body, and Brightpaw's proportions are not necessarily there. But it's an improvement. It's a try. This is definitely me making a trial step towards what it would eventually become. I kind of forgot that I had made a full body Brightpaw at some point. I think I changed her full body design later for one of the recent illustrations, but that's okay. Mousefur, honestly, I still sort of don't like her design. I haven't changed it, but I think her being the basic she-cat is the defining thing in my head. So having her as the most basic-looking she-cat is still a thing that's fine. It's a thing that I went with, and it's okay. It ended up working out in this piece's favor because it cut down on the number of colors that I was going to have to merge together. I had done plenty of profile drawings at this point of the headshots for videos, so I knew how to make color palettes within a single cat work, but through a lot of this first section of Trip Through Time, you can see me really struggling to figure out how to make cats who are different colors and different patterns work together in a single illustration. And I knew I couldn't just design all, hundreds, 1,000+ characters in the series to match a similar color scheme, because it would get really boring after a while, and there are a bunch of cats with distinct design elements that I wanted to keep. So I needed to find a different way around this, and I wouldn't for a long time. But I eventually did. The background here is still very, very basic. I didn't learn about backgrounds or even want to learn about backgrounds for a while. Not for lack of effort, but because these early drawings took me so long that I just wanted to get them over with. Here we have Rising Storm, which I think is honestly the first success, I would say. It's the first illustration, and certainly the only one, I would argue, in the original arc, where I more or less like it. I like what I was going for, at the very least. We have Firestar Sandstorm going to rescue Cloudpaw with Ravenpaw in tow. I checked out at least who was involved and what they would generally be feeling, and I chose some more extreme expressions for the cats involved. I also chose to do what appears to be some backlighting, but I didn't fully commit, and it kind of looks weird. I think I was trying to go for a sunset here, because I don't even remember. I don't think I looked it up and saw that it was a sunset. I think I just wanted to draw a sunset because I thought it was going to be a way of making the colors work together better. Which it was, to be fair. But a lot of the colors working in this piece also has to do with the fact that Sandstorm and Firestar's color palettes naturally work well together, and then Cloudpaw and Ravenpaw are both neutral tones, so they didn't clash. Sandstorm's back patterns, I will admit, was a struggle for me, but I ended up roughly liking where I ended up, and drawing a cat for the first time from the back really pushed me to experiment with different design elements than I usually use. I also pretty much appreciate the posing of Sandstorm. Oh gosh, I need to stop using that near black shading. That's really getting to me. Cloudpaw's expression was definitely the thing I was the most proud of here. It was the first time where I had really understood what tiny pupils were for. And ignore his stub legs. This only happened because I had actually done a sketch and had already realized which parts of his body would be hidden. This is a technique I would definitely apply later, and I'm proud of myself for figuring that part out. I still hadn't figured out how to use clipping masks to only put the gradients on the irises instead of letting them seep into the fur or the rest of the eye. But it's a start, it's a start. What I really appreciated in this was it was my first time doing what I'll call an industrial and urban background, and I ended up really, really liking it. I liked being able to use these almost vector illustrations, put in the effort to make them look even, and using these straight lines of outline and shading. I really enjoyed doing it. And this was probably the first time I had ever enjoyed doing a background in comparison to something else. I put significantly more time and effort into it than any of the previous illustrations, and tried even to alter the colors after the fact to make them work together. So this is definitely... It doesn't hold up to my current standards, but it's a precursor to what will become my standards. Now we get to a dangerous path. I wish this was better. I really wish this was better. This was done in May, however, so obviously nearing the end of school, I was already rushed, and at this point I was trying to get all of my drawings done in the space of a day, or less. So I was not putting a whole lot of effort in, and not using a whole lot of the lessons that I had learned over the past 2 illustrations. I was doing Brambleclaw and Tawny Pelt's designs from the back, which I was doing my best, I'll grant myself that, but I really didn't look up or understand how tabby markings worked. I was at least trying to do back shading for the first time in totality, but I wasn't actually looking up how to do that or how the light source would work, so again, thing I'll improve on later. And Brackenfur is still Brackenfur away. I don't know why I keep making his eyes so tall. That was a big problem. Eyes honestly look significantly cuter if you can push them further down towards the center of the face. It looks more natural, and certainly more attractive as a cat design. But, yeah, sure. Brackenfur's a tall-headed guy. His design is honestly one of the best I think I did at this early stage in terms of the tabby markings. But that's mostly because I had already done a full-body illustration of him. I think for a Warrior of the Week back in the day, or some event on Discord, I don't remember exactly. But being able to do that definitely helped me cement his full-body design in a way that none of the other characters really had. I suppose save for Firestar, because Firestar is just orange. He should be orange. He's always going to be orange. He's just orange. He's not a tabby. Oh my gosh! But he's really only basic as a result of that. Sandstorms, I think, was the one I had the most fun with, because I had already decided on her back design, and now I got to transfer what I had already designed to the front as well, which was a new experience for me. And then Tigerstar. At the point where I was doing Tigerstar, it was nearing the end of the day. I was already exhausted. I did a really, really rough job on this. I messed up on half of his markings and had to redo a lot of his scarring. I think I did some of his coloring on the wrong layer, so I couldn't transfer it over. I might have to delete all of this shading. Nope, okay. But it was yes, the chin markings and the brown. Now I have to redo the scarring again. Yep, exactly. And then here comes the background, where I'm just going to lay down a swath of green and some... airbrush shading. No detail in the trees, a flat blue sky. The backgrounds, every time the backgrounds come in at this stage, I lose faith in the drawing. Now we have the Darkest Hour, end of the series. I knew I wanted to make this one big, and I kind of threw aside my burgeoning rule about choosing an underrated moment, because I knew I specifically wanted Firestar being able to charge ahead with his 9 life givers all around him, as he's about to battle Scourge with the battle raging on in the background. I wanted this to be an epic illustration, and I wanted it to be obvious. I should say at this point that the dates at the top of the screen actually say when the drawing was finished. If it was a multi-day illustration, it would just be the day it was completed, not the day it began. But this will definitely be significantly earlier than the dates you got to see it. I always tend to work on my videos ahead, but particularly with the Trip Through Time illustrations, because I know that the process of putting them together can take an awfully long time sometimes. Darkest Hour, though, I more or less like the headshots. I had gotten very used to doing the headshots, and this is actually the first instance where I mocked up designs for the characters I was going to be drawing. Good for me. I like this Lionheart design much, much better. But I will say that I sort of dropped the ball in the background. I did do something for this illustration that I didn't do for any of the previous ones, which I will give myself credit for. I looked up references. I looked up poses of cats running and cats battling. I looked up to see where they would be and what they would look like, which parts of them would be showing. And I appreciate that. I'm still doing the airbrush shading. You can't tell when you airbrush shade. I put down the opacity too much, and it doesn't show up. I need to stop doing that. A lot of the designs I put up here are a little rough. They were some of my earlier ones. Redtail is a really tricky one for me because I almost only ever show him in headshots, but his main distinguishing feature is in his tail. He's effectively brown except his tail. So I have figured out ways to deal with that more recently, but definitely not yet. Otherwise, I think the front of this illustration is pretty good for what it was. I think it was doing fine. This part, though, again, I was just getting tired. I had sketched in rough estimates of what all the reference pictures look like, and I basically just drew them as black silhouettes. I would definitely try to characterize them more if I was drawing this today. Make them into specific characters, or blur them out to make it more obvious that they're part of the background. I also don't like how the two trees blend into each other, but again, backgrounds. Now we get into Midnight. This is the first illustration, honestly across the series, that I would say I genuinely like. It's one where I can look at it and be proud, in some regards at least, because I had figured out a specific moment, a specific scene, all of the characters who would be there, and most importantly, I had figured out that the lighting for them would be very, very different than the lighting I'd been doing so far. I was going to be placing these cats inside the Moonstone, so in addition to my mock-ups for these cats' designs being generally a little better, especially for Little Cloud, mostly for Little Cloud, I also knew that I was going to be using these gems, which would allow me to use more of the industrial, the sharp backgrounds that I was growing to appreciate, and the overall lighting and coloring for the cage would be, for the Moonstone Cave, would be a very dull, gray, darkened light, with most of the light source coming specifically from the Moonstone. And if I can remember correctly, I tried to deal with this in a different way than I would deal with it now, but I did try. I colored the crystals differently. I made the line art of the crystals white, and had a little gradient glow around it, which was a big step towards some future illustration work for me. Being able to color the line art to make it appear different ways for the background was a big and very necessary step. But also, I realized that in order to make the cats fit into that, I would need to color their line art as well. This is, for a while, a thing I did just for this illustration, because I didn't really like how it looked on Mothwing. I thought that her line art faded away too much when I used, effectively, her coloring, because all of the other cats in the room had darker pelt colors, and therefore darker line art. This is a thing I would eventually conquer and tackle, but today, it was a thing that I was disappointed in. Honestly, though, especially with Little Cloud, I love Little Cloud's adorable little face. That was the sweetest darn thing. I really, really appreciated this drawing. I appreciated the different poses. For the first time, I was using a separate lighting color as part of the cell shading, where it would show up. Roughly, I mean, Leafpool's pressing her nose right up to that Moonstone. She should have a lot more light than I put on her. But generally speaking, I was doing my best to acknowledge where the shading would be and follow it, and I colored the entire illustration to boot. And then we have Moonrise. This is a fine picture. I don't think there's anything special about it. Most of what I was trying to do here was emphasize the symmetry between Stormfur and Feathertail, Squirrelpaw and Crowpaw, and then Brook in the center. But I don't think I did much more than that. I went for very basic framing, basic posing and expressions. Even the headshots at the top are things I've definitely done before in other forms, so I don't think I broke much new ground here. The other important thing to note, of course, is that Stormfur's design is changing, and Feathertail's for that matter, in the middle of this drawing and without any preparation, which definitely not a thing I would recommend in the future, but it did help me nail down what I want these two to actually look like on a full body scale. And I used some full gray shading all the way across, which doesn't really show up in the end, but I think my aim was making them look closer to each other. The whole point, of course, is that Stormfur and Feathertail's argument about their respective lovers is entirely symmetrical between them. But other than that, nothing special in the art. Dawn, however, I do really think was important, because Dawn was one of the first times where I really looked at the whole scene and tried to make a environment look interesting. This was the moment where they were going to see the shooting star from Feathertail that would lead them to the lake eventually. And it was a group shot of all of the characters all together, where definitely each of them would have different perspectives on this, unless you're Tawny Pelt, because they didn't give Tawny Pelt a character much. But otherwise, everyone here was going to have a different expression, different posing, different thoughts about the situation, and the environment itself could look at the caves of Moonstone that they were just coming out of, across the fields and the mountains that they would have to cross, and away towards the lake that would lie somewhere beyond there. And then, of course, this is also a night scene, so I had to consider the shading and the sky. I did my best here, and I think it's definitely an improvement on some of my earlier attempts, but I wouldn't necessarily draw any of these elements this way now. The clouds being all one solid mass, even blurred out, is just not super realistic for clouds. All of the environments essentially being one flat color for each of their distinguishing features, but maybe with a gradient shading over the top, doesn't necessarily make it all that interesting to look at. But I will say, this particular squirrel flight with her big poofy tail curled over, is one of my honestly favorite drawings of squirrel flight, and is what inspired me to give her that tail in the future. I just really, truly adore giving Squirrel Flight what is effectively a squirrel tail, and it makes her perk up and emphasizes her shortness, which I think in this case is a good thing. Basically what you can see here is that I'm starting to really consider the characters involved, and putting some of that character into the illustration, rather than just their designs. I'm thinking about who they are when I pose them, which is something I failed to do for a lot of the characters before. Not all of them, but an awful lot of them were more generic in their posing, and I didn't even necessarily decide who they were before I drew them. This is also, well, I liked the lighting before I took it away, but I accidentally didn't save it, so that kind of went away. Starlight was actually building on all of that as an idea. It took a very, very developed background, and both of the cats here are interacting with it. Sorreltail is watching over Leafpool as she touches the Moonpool itself and develops this new connection with Skyclan at the lake. And of course, this whole illustration is centered around the Moonpool itself, so once I finish with these cat sketches to figure out where they lie in the illustration, my first priority is mapping out the background, which is a big change from all of the first arc where the background was a sloppy afterthought. Here I was really thinking about, okay, what does the Moonpool look like? Where is this beautiful waterfall? How do I fill up the area? What sorts of stones are we using around the edges versus closer to the tree? What does the tree look like? How do its branches stretch out? This is a half moon for the half moon gathering, so I'd better put that in the sky. I have these bushes enclosing the area a little bit and these ferns to map it out, but also the sky itself and the moon and the lake down below were given pretty rigid details, specific details. You could even see, which you probably shouldn't be able to see, the little farmhouse down at the bottom. So yes, I put significantly more effort into this specific background than I ever had before, and I kind of enjoyed it. I definitely don't mind drawing cats at all, but honestly, the backgrounds have over time become some of my favorite pieces of a drawing, because it really helps it feel like a scene. It makes it feel like these cats live somewhere and are doing something. And yeah, I like it. I think the shading could use some work, though. Sorreltail, though, I'm always going to love Sorreltail. I already appreciated her design before going into this, but it was one of my first times getting to map out a full tortoiseshell or calico cat, besides Tawny Pelt, whose design I never really liked. And Sorreltail is just, she's a sweetie pie. This is also one of the first times where I noticed, ooh, shoot, Sorreltail's color palette really doesn't match with the illustration. So I ended up using a darker blue in order to fix that and make it blend in more. It was a step towards what I would do later. Then we have Twilight. Twilight's in a similar boat to Moonrise, where it definitely gets across the characterization that I wanted to. It's Squirrel Flight considering all of her conundrums in this book with all of the relationships in her life. But it's nothing special in the illustration department. It's mostly just communicating the emotions of the characters. Which is fair, because I was actually really struggling to figure out what sort of illustration I would even do for Twilight. Twilight has so much time spent on characters. They're going through a variety of different social drama and character relationships and are failing in just about all of it. Other than Cinderpelt's consistent dread over knowing that she's going to die, which we don't get to see much outside of the prologue, most of the book is spent on cats feeling a lot of stuff at each other or just at themselves. And there weren't a lot of drawable moments, is my point. But I don't think it was necessarily a bad job, and I liked being able to draw Squirrel Flight hugging her little tail. That was sweet. Leafpool's perspective is a little warped here, though, and her eyes should definitely be further down her head, or her nose should be upright if I was implying that she was looking up. Crowfeather is Crowfeather. I've drawn him a few times before, and he's a rather basic design. Rather basic expression. There's a lot of this that is just... It is what it is. I was in my comfort zone here, and I wasn't pushing myself, which I try not to do in the modern day, but it's fine to have a little comfort drawing every so often, where you just... You know how to do everything that you're doing. You can also see me reverting here back to the trend where I don't actually really care about what the background looks like, so it ends up being one of the last things I draw. Oh, Brambleclaw's face is really wonky. I didn't notice that before. Wow, his whole face is askew from his head. That's why I'm having such a hard time getting the markings to work. Wow. Oh, I needed to fix that. I also apparently hadn't figured out how I want to draw trees yet, because those are still just green blobs on brown blobs. I did fix that, however, in Sunset, both the perspective and the background. This illustration I decided to do Daisy deciding to return her kits to ThunderClan. And in addition to this meaning that I can draw my baby girl Hazeltail as a literal baby girl, it also meant that I would be able to draw the inside of a cabin with hay, a barn, which meant that I was going to be able to do an industrial background again. I don't know why I'm so tickled by these. It's just being able to see the straight pieces come together and the rigid lines of the building making it so clear where the perspective works. It's very nice to my little brain. I really genuinely loved sketching out this whole thing. The one thing that I would say for myself is that I really needed to sketch all of this out before sizing the cats, or resize them afterwards, because I ended up making the cats way, way too big to be in this bar, and they'd be hitting their heads on the ceiling, even with that forced perspective. I did enjoy being able to draw the hay and the snow, though, and both of those elements being very bright against the dark background made me aware that I really would need to color the line art of this background to make it work, which I did, and I enjoyed it, and I applied that lesson to the future. This is honestly around the time where I realized that I both needed to and wanted to start improving something with each illustration I did. I wanted to go in with a specific goal of what I was drawing, and I started seeking out advice from my friends more often around here too. This was actually, I think, the first illustration that I excitedly sent to one of my friends as soon as it was done, and even I think a couple progress shots in the middle of it, because it was taking me multiple days, but I was enjoying seeing what was coming out the other side. The actual process of drawing is, as I said, sometimes tiring. It's tedious, and it makes you spend a lot of hours at your desk on meticulous work, but being able to see the product that comes out of it is really, really fulfilling. And I love this illustration. It's one of the first ones I actually love. Then we have the site. The thing I decided to focus on here was how to portray characters I know and have drawn before as young, as younger versions of themselves, both in the almost apprentice-aged 3 and the tiny, tiny Ice Kitten Fox Kit as they're being scowled upon by a worried little fernclad there. I think I almost made it. I think the character acting is doing its job here. Lion Kit is definitely a very adventurous, teasing little kit, and his legs are definitely much skinnier than they will be when he grows up. Holly Kit is definitely accepting the teasing, but not necessarily giving into it. She's trying to look more serious. I also tried to do something new with the background here, but I still hadn't quite figured out how I wanted to portray either the ThunderClan camp in general, or how foliage works, how rocks work in my style. I was still experimenting in that with just about every drawing I did using those materials. So definitely, there are things to improve on, but I think this was a good start, and I was trying something here. I do genuinely like J-Kit's expression. I feel like someone just cuffed him around the ear, or he's expecting someone to. But this is my old J-Kit design, and I have mixed feelings about it versus the new one. I think this one definitely stands out a lot more, but it didn't stand out very nicely when placed against most of the other cats. I think it was too large a contrast for the general designs that I've been making for everyone else. I think it was a step in the right direction. That's all I'll say. I don't love looking back at this one, especially with the color composition, but you can see at the end I did try to fix it with some overlay of brown and cream. This is a big deal. This was the first comic redraw I did. I wasn't actually sure when I first started the comic reviews what I was even going to do for them, because I had been drawing little underrated or just moments from the stories, but in a comic, all of the moments have already been drawn for you. So what I decided to do, and partially to pay tribute to James L. Barry and the other comic artists, was that I was going to redraw one of their pages with my designs, my interpretation of the backgrounds. Especially in James's work, he tends to make the backgrounds in his black and white comics relatively not sparse, but lacking in detail. It's up to interpretation what exactly is going on in a lot of his backgrounds, which is perfectly fine. It works well, and it works especially well if you're on a deadline. But as a result of that, when I was going into these comic pages, I realized I did have a lot more that I got to interpret and make up as I went than I thought I would. But it also led me to do things like adding more detail to the trees, figuring out exactly where they should be placed and how their bark should go. This was the first time I put bark on trees in these illustrations, which is incredible. I should have done that before. I got to figure out what these plants were and where the background went, what the sky was like. And for all of this, I very explicitly never look at the colored versions of the comics until I have fully finished the illustration. For any of the comics who have gotten color redraws, Graystripe's Adventure, Ravenpaw's Path, I think? I don't even remember what the name is for the collection of 3. But any of those where the set has been released together with color, I didn't look at them because I wanted to use my own interpretation of what these backgrounds were like, what the color compositions should look like, and often it means that my redraws look very, very different from what was probably intended by James, but that's okay. I like that. This is also when I first got to hash out exactly what Millie would look like, and it turns out I really enjoy her design. I really like being able to do it. A thing I can say, since For the purposes of these comics, I ended up drawing her a solid, 12 to 13 times. I don't like Graystripe as much. I don't like drawing Graystripe. He's both very basic in design, which he was supposed to be. I wanted him to look basic. But also just... he has some of the hallmarks of my earlier design work, the forcing myself to slap something on the chest to make it cohesive, rather than just allowing them to have simpler markings. He's okay. He's fine. I don't know if I would redo him, because I've used him in so many videos, but he's just not my favorite. That's okay. For the backgrounds, I was still using the strokes over and over and over again to make the grass, which I would grow out of eventually, especially since I had started doing the line art for the swaths of grass at the back. So I will eventually fix that. But another factor of the comics that I will say I should have expected going in is that they forced me to draw a lot of new poses that I hadn't tried before. And just because of the way James's style is different from mine and the speed he was doing them at, I often had to alter or fudge, occasionally fix, especially in the Sasa mangas, what the poses looked like to fit my style and fit my anatomy. And it allowed me to see what those poses would look like in my style, which allowed me to start experimenting a little bit more in the future. We'll get there eventually. But in the meantime, I really, really liked this. I liked how the colors were turning out. I liked the specific tones of green I used for the background, and mixing it with the browns. It was nice. This was a very, very nice step. Next we come to Secrets of the Clans, which honestly was one of my favorite illustrations ever on a conceptual level. I knew that in Secrets there were going to be a whole lot of tiny short stories where probably all of them are simultaneously over and underrated. You'll have a few people who really, truly love each and every one of those tiny little stories, and a bunch more people who will completely ignore all of those stories because they're in a field guide that a lot of people have assumed is decanonized by now. But what I really, really wanted to do for this illustration was use what we've come to know about the future of the series to inform how I drew this. Secrets of the Clans is the only Super Edition that is explicitly fantastical in some sense. It was designed to be the stories that the clans have told each other about their own history. And now that we have Dawn of the Clans in the future, we know that history. We know what happened here at the founding of the clans, at that first battle. So what I decided to do was use my existing designs for those 4 clan founders and alter them slightly. I exaggerated their features. Windstar is taller and sleeker. She has more wind-like curves to her tabby patterns. Riverstar is rougher, more serene, and uncaring, unfeeling. He's fluffier and has a rounder tail and significantly rounder markings to evoke a river. He is bluer in shade. Tall Star is significantly blacker, even more of a dark, pure black tone than her normal design. She is sharper and shaped more exactly like a pine tree. And Thunderstar, of course, has literal lightning markings all across his fur, along with the massive paws and the blazing bright red fur. These are all of the exaggerated caricatures of the founders that you would expect the clans to know of now. And of course, Clear Sky in the back is in his normal design, but faded, barely visible, because in the modern incarnation of the story, they don't know that he was there. They don't know that Skyclan existed. He's not a part of this tale. So, yeah, conceptually, I really, really, really liked this drawing, and I enjoyed doing it more as a result. But, on a technical level, there are some good things about it too. I don't like how I did the blood, but I do like the techniques I was trying to use here for some of it. Firestar's Quest. This is one of my first explorations into cool posing on my own. I was doing a cat circling around another cat in unison. This is Cloudstar reuniting with Birdflight, if you weren't aware. And for this, I knew that I wanted them to be the center of the illustration, their being able to reunite. I hadn't designed either of these characters ahead of time, so both of them were designed on the spot. But as you can see, I have mock-ups of them for once, which allows you to actually plan out your design ahead of time and make sure it works as a whole, and that ideally it works with the other characters in the scene, but I don't think I did that. Spotted Leaf is also here. This is also admittedly one of the first times where I went into the book and at the very least noted who was there. I went back specifically to check who all is there, so that I could design the illustration to more closely match the actual moment I was drawing. I've never really liked my Spotted Leaf design. I don't think it's necessarily fitting the bill of what a Spotted Leaf design should be. It's not really a tortoiseshell so much as it's a spotted, splashed fantasy cat, but it's okay. Echo Song I actually did end up liking, and I think having these mock-ups as my first designs of them was giving me more of a freedom than I thought it would. When I designed them as the headshots, my main priority is making sure that it fits with the other headshots, that it fits in the sizing, that it fits the general design conventions I have for the eyes, the nose, the fur tufts, the amount of markings. I want to make sure that it matches those closely enough. But if I'm doing a mock-up in the middle of a trip through time, I'm essentially designing it off of a random cat that I draw up in an instant, which ends up with me making some more unique design choices sometimes, if I happen to come across them in the moment. But I still think I have the issue of the colors not necessarily fitting together quite as well. Firestar is kind of blinding here. Dark River. This was my adventure in perspective because I wanted to show Cinderpaw, sorry. Cinderheart is who she becomes, so that wasn't even remotely right. Cinderpaw falling from a tree as she was attempting to rescue Mousepaw. This is definitely a good attempt. I did my best, but there are a lot of things I would critique myself on now. I like how I added more detail to the trees, the leaves, the lake, the sand than I would have in many of my other drawings. But I don't necessarily think that the perspective worked out all that well. I think Mousepaw, who I'm drawing right now, actually worked about as well as I could have done it at this time. Being able to wrap his tail around the tree and making sure that I lined that up with the line art underneath to color it properly. I think that part works fine, but that perspective doesn't match the second perspective that I used for Cinderpaw. I also wish that I had mapped out the actual pose of this more concretely in my sketch rather than just doing my simple blocky green. Because you can see me trying to figure out in the moment how the heck her legs work, and I kind of failed. I managed to put her left thigh, over her belly, which is not how that would work. And looks really silly to look back on, but you can see me trying. I'm applying a lot of the lessons that I ended up getting from the comic artists to add more detail to my backgrounds, to try out more inventive posing and expressions. And in the long run, that will be a good thing for me. It just so happens that it's more difficult right now. Oh, another accident you'll be able to see in a minute is that I was fully convinced in the sketch that Brackenfur's front legs would be hidden behind Hollyleaf, so I didn't draw them. But I end up moving them around to fit the composition better, and it becomes very obvious that I accidentally made three-legged Brackenfur, which... oops. But that's okay, that's okay. We live, we learn, we grow. And pretty much all of the eyes on the bottom cats are way too big. But it's okay. It's alright. And here we come to another comic page. Being able to follow up that first comic and realizing how much growth I was able to accomplish by taking those lessons, I went into this one with the aim of doing a lot of investigation, putting in a lot of effort, and trying out a lot of new things. That included the simpler things like the posing and this particular variety of tree where you can see the back from the front as well. The wider scenescapes and pushing some cats into the background, zooming in and pulling out that camera to show more interesting silhouettes and design elements. All of that was very cool. But also I decided that I was going to give each panel a different shading scheme and a different color scheme. This is because what the page is doing overall is showing a journey. It's showing the length these cats have gone to stick up for each other and bond with each other over this very long journey, which is extremely sweet and is a very interesting thing to try and capture. Part of the way I decided to do that was by making the time period change throughout the illustrations. We go from this beautiful early morning to this midday run through the grass. Also, this is also a moment where I'm fairly certain I had opened my Patreon by this point, and they had been the ones to choose this comic page. I also had them choose what type of bird these two were chasing, because it was not obvious in the original. And they voted on a magpie. So that is what I ended up researching, looking up to see what magpie markings look like. Honestly, having the patrons to turn to and push me in more creative directions, and also just having them behind me and knowing that I want to make better work for them to justify their sport, has definitely pushed me to experiment a lot over the years, and this is one of the earliest examples you can see of that. Yes, here we go. Here's the magpie. The magpie is a beautiful bird, but it's all sheer whites and sheer blacks, which I was having trouble fitting into this color scheme, when otherwise Millie's light tan, gray stripes, gray worked very well in all of these different color schemes, and I still wasn't sure how to force color schemes of cats that don't naturally fit in to fit in anyway, so I'll keep working on that one. But for right here, you can see I was just drawing out these lovely little poses, making sure that the kitties had their correct expressions. Millie coming back with her mouse here is just adorable. But honestly, in the posing, the last one is definitely my favorite. I loved being able to draw a laughing cat and a sopping wet cat in this beautiful sunlit sky from the sunset. It's honestly, it's both beautiful to me and a really interesting challenge. Oh, this third panel, of course, was just a gray sky, probably about to get hit with a storm, maybe in the evening. And then this last one is just this beautiful sunlit scene. We have the reeds and the rocks and the river, and I put an awful lot of effort into trying to get each of those elements detailed enough to be where I was happy with them, and so that the whole illustration looked vibrant and colorful. The clouds in the background across that sunlit sky is just, it's one of my favorite parts of it. And I ended up going over all of these panels with a cast, a little soft airbrushing of different colors to fit each illustration. And for this last one, I'm pretty sure it was almost a rainbow, which is kind of just self-indulgent. I love rainbow, but it fit with the sunset more than it fit with any of the other panels. This sopping wet gray stripe may be my favorite gray stripe I have ever done. And you can see I was trying to, yes, there's the rainbow. I was trying to put the reflection of the sunset into the water to make it look more deep. So yeah, it was fun. Then we have Outcast. This is another one where I was determined to draw one specific moment, and I threw aside all other concerns in the aims of that. I was determined to draw this exact moment from Outcast where Hollyleaf, or Hollypaw at this moment, says that she doesn't understand why Berrypaw and Honeypaw are so infatuated with each other. and that she'd much rather be a clan leader than a nursing queen. She just doesn't get it. And she tries to reach out to her mother about this and say, I think this is what I want. And her mother says, oh, don't you worry, you'll understand when you get older. I think at this point everyone's aware how I feel about asexual Hollyleaf. But basically, I was just determined to draw the illustration because of that. The problem here, though, is that other than the posing, other than having a trying to be comforting squirrel flight, a disappointed Hollyleaf, a rambunctious and boastful little berry paw, and of course Honeypaw just fawning over him endlessly, other than those 4 characters, I had very little clue of what the background should look like. And I had never really done any planning for what ThunderClan's camp in general should look like. So it ends up being very basic and very empty in a way that I wouldn't want to repeat in the modern day. But the characters themselves, I think we're doing well. The one thing that I would critique myself on in that front is that, Hollyleaf, your legs are way too thin and very uneven. I was definitely sticking them together because I wanted her to look uncomfortable and I wanted to draw less legs, but it does end up looking a little weird. The size and thickness of my cat legs over the years has definitely ebbed and flowed substantially, but it's okay. It's okay. I did end up... this was after I had started drawing the covers for Paws of Stars, so I did have a pretty strong idea of what I wanted Berry Paw and Honey Paw to look like at the very least, and I definitely utilized those in this illustration. But Honey Paw is also way too blinding, again, especially for being in the back of the drawing, and there's nothing in the foreground besides the 2 characters to draw your eye. But we are back to a comic page, which is, generally speaking, where I'm happy. But this particular one that was chosen just happens to not be super detailed. There's a lot of background elements, but the whole page is essentially communicating one thing, because we're slowing down to see the dread and sadness and grief that Graystripe is experiencing at the loss of his home. So the whole page, rather than showing a wide swath of events, is mostly here to show you over time that we're in this rainy, tearful, sad time, and that Millie is about to comfort Graystripe. Which essentially means that I only drew 3 cats for this entire comic page. But that's okay. That's okay. It did give me a chance to practice different ways of drawing some background elements, different ways of drawing rocks and dirt and puddles and ferns and little grasses that I hadn't tried before. And most of these I do end up applying in other forms down the line, which I appreciate. But most of the characterization was just done down here. There wasn't a whole lot of detail to how Graystripe was sitting in my initial Slappy sketch, but I know that he is definitely lying down and doing the cat equivalent of crying, even though cats really shouldn't cry, if we're being genetically honest. The one thing I did do here for the first time was 2 layers of shading. I knew that the only light source would be coming from outside and it wouldn't be much light, so I started with some backlighting. But I also really emphasized the parts where Graystripe's body would be shading himself. There are some places I should have done that I didn't as well, like the bottom of his front legs or the bottom of his tail. But it was an attempt, and it was my first attempt, and it's one I will continue into the future, as I've been saying. Millie, however, is almost entirely backlit because she is outside and is receiving that backlighting. She does have a much more direct light source than Graystripe did, and overall, it wasn't special, but it wasn't bad. Cats of the Clans was honestly the most challenging one I ever had to construct, because it's a bunch of stories, not even stories, but biographies about cats in the clans. So, trying to figure out what I would even draw for this one was a challenge. But what I ended up doing was choosing an underrated member of each group, so ThunderClan, ShadowClan, BloodClan, Outside the Clan's tribe, and drawing them. For a lot of these, this meant that I was drawing headshots of characters I had not drawn before. So I could make them up on the spot, and most of these, I think, got applied to be headshots very quickly, since that was effectively what I was doing for this illustration. It's not necessarily conveying a moment, but Cats of the Clan specifically doesn't really have a moment, and the illustration designs that I came up with for Bone and Running Nose in particular, I did really appreciate. I really, really liked those. Sometimes coming up with designs during Trip Through Time is the best way to do it. And, you know, Brightheart's here. I love Brightheart. Generally speaking, though, this was very, very comfort zone work for me. I'm incredibly used to doing headshots at this point, and it was just doing those on a larger scale with the symbols that I had already designed all being the same color and a vaguely blue floaty background. Nothing special, but it's perfectly fine. I like all of the cats in here. I just think that it wasn't really pushing myself in any of the ways that I would want. At the very least, I did fix Silverstream from the ways I was drawing her in the first arc, and I appreciate that much, at least. One thing I did end up doing here, because it was so very basic, was doing a more top-down shading rather than a diagonal one. And I also used these little feathering things at the bottom of each cat to imply that they were fading away rather than just drawing in a bit of airbrushing, which I think was a little bit of extra effort that went a long way in helping them fit more into this overall illustration. I also, helpfully, colored the line art of those little feathery bits at the end, because I knew I would need them to fade off into the background, and they couldn't do that if they were starkly black. So, yeah, there have been some strides made in this drawing, it just, you know, wasn't much. I do really, really like Bones, though. At this point, I had started doing a thing where, with all of the cats who had collars for any reason, I was trying to design them very purposefully. To fit their design, first of all, but also fit what I thought their owner might give them. Bone has a little collar that's camouflage, almost, of a red and an orange color. It's very subtle, and it comes across as red from a distance, but yeah, I do like it. Rise of Scourge. Okay, so this one, honestly not my favorite. I was going off of a very, very different comic style than I was used to with James L. Barry, and I was having a hard time escaping that style as I was going into this. This particular comic artist just used an awful lot more detail than I was used to in Barry's art. So I ended up having a lot more strict guidelines to work with how I was drawing this. So other than putting in the cat's designs, which from a distance aren't as noticeable, there wasn't a whole lot of me, I'll say, going into this picture. It really was a redraw of someone else's art, which I didn't feel the greatest about. What I did end up doing to augment this is that I was trying some new techniques with how I varied the grasses and the trees, and tried to make them look distinctly separate from each other across different trunks, different branches, different leaves. Which was again, step in the right direction, but the problem here is that I hadn't quite figured out yet why or how different trunks and leaves look different, so I was kind of coloring them randomly based on whichever ones were next to each other, rather than doing it with any intentionality. The one part I will say I really, really liked was the perspectives that I used on this bell and later on the fencing below. For both of those, the perspective was already mapped in for me, but I used those perspectives to color them appropriately. I made sure that the bell looked as metallic as I was capable of making it, with a mix of hard and soft shading in a variety of nice and ugly colors, and I made sure that the fence looked straight together, but had different wood paneling to make it look cohesive even from the top. I'm not doing a great job of explaining that one because most of the paneling and most of the composition of these was already done for me as part of the comic, but I was taking some lessons from drawing it. And honestly, that's something worth doing too. If you are having trouble with your style, if you aren't really sure where to grow yet, a good idea is honestly taking some comic art in particular, since it has so much different posing and expressions and background elements, and trying to redraw it in your style. Figure out how you could apply those lessons. And you might come away with things that you would like to apply later. It's fun. Little hunched up Scourge is even more closed off and sleepy than I usually draw my sleeping cats, so again, good lessons to apply. But the background itself is nothing special. Really, the only thing I did was extend it across the back of the whole piece. Eclipse. This is one I really liked much more in concept than in execution, because even at this stage, I was regretting my decision to compose the piece this way. I wanted to use more of that interesting perspective and cats being at different sight lines, which I did do. Cinderheart is swimming, and I'm going to put her into a lake, so I'm going to do some experimenting with how to portray that. Jayfeather and Leafpool are both seen from their backs, but with some interesting angles to them. Jayfeather you can see is at a not quite 3/4, maybe 7/8 angle. And Leafpool, you can only see her head as she's peeking in to see this swimming training session. But with both of them, I think I both didn't research enough and wasn't experienced enough in these perspectives to do them all that well. You would not be able to see this much of either Leafpool's eye, nose, or mouth from this angle if that's how her head and ears are positioned. But I wanted to show them, so I forced it in anyway, even though it looks strange and is right next to the camera. The big thing I don't like about this illustration, though, is that there's all this space in the center that's just for the sand and the front part of the ocean. I wish I had done something with that. Next we get on to the Sasha mangas, which were not necessarily learning experiences in the way of the other two, but they were big confidence boosters, because the Sasha mangas were not drawn by someone who is used to drawing cats. So a lot of times I would have to significantly alter the way that the posing worked for all of these cat drawings in order to make them remotely close to accurate anatomy. And I added in substantially more detail for the backgrounds, and even started using some of the foliage brushes that have been here the whole time, but I was scared to use for any of the foliage in my backgrounds. I also just like drawing Sasha. She has very nice sleek shapes and is a nicely colored cat that blends in well to these woodland backgrounds. She was very easy to fit into these illustrations, basically. I still don't like that I'm relying on the draw stick grass shards, but this tree is really pretty. I was going off of just a silhouette for the original comic page, but I wanted to make it into more of a broad night sky. And even here at the bottom, you can see me substantially altering how the anatomy works, because a cat's midsection is not that long, even in... Well, my style is more squished in general, but even outside of that, it would not look like that. Generally speaking, though, I was just testing out a lot of background techniques for these, for different brushes with the backgrounds and foliage, different things to mark out the sand and areas of the stars and trees. It's a step in the right direction, and I like the overall vibe, at least. Long shadows. Yeah, I was definitely trying to take a step here of adding more into the drawings. I specifically started researching every little aspect of what was going on here. I noted that Lineblaze was going to be holding Toadfoot down as he tried to scream and couldn't, so that was going to be a funny element. Hollyleaf and Jayfeather are watching from the sidelines as Flametail thanks StarClan and Tigerpaw, or Flamepaw thanks StarClan, and Tigerpaw and Dawnpaw congratulate each other on a job well done of saving their clan from the evil soul. This is a very sweet scene, and I enjoyed noting down all of the aspects of it. But honestly, this is the illustration where it really sunk into me that despite all of the lessons I had learned, if I put a lot of cats in together whose color palettes don't naturally mesh, I didn't yet know how to make them mesh. And I tried my darndest here, but I decided in this illustration that that was going to be the thing I had to focus on next, because it doesn't work out here. Flametail's design in general already has a lot of very high contrast with that bright orange against that bright white. And then Tigerpaw is adding in that warm brown of a variety of shades. Dawnpaw is this bright beige. And then Hollyleaf and Jayfeather in the back are a black and a cool gray. There's just too many colors going on here, and I didn't do anything to merge them together better. So it comes across as less cohesive than I wanted it. I actually ended up liking the sketch of this one more than the final piece, which was a sign that I wanted something to change. What I will give myself credit for here is that I really do like the composition I tried to do in this piece, and the division of that big tree in the center, cutting off our ThunderClan cats from our ShadowClan ones, other than Toadfoot, of course, in a way that helps, draw your eye to both sides of this moment and what's happening for the two of them. The adults and children are taking this moment very differently. The trees are also getting slightly better, and I took my lesson from Sasha's manga to figure out how to draw fallen over logs. But generally speaking, good try, and there is definitely some work to be done. By the time I was starting the background for this piece, I was kind of already demoralized by the kitties. But I'll get there. I will get there. Our next Sasha manga, and this is probably my favorite of the three. I think the color palettes of the final are more to my personal preference, but this was the first one where I managed to make complementary colors work for me, a bluey tone and a warm browny beigey tone across most of the piece. Patch Kit, by the way, does not have any official design, or did not have any official design other than where his markings were at the time of this publishing, because we did not have a colored Sasha manga yet. So I decided to make him a blue little kitten, specifically because I knew that the ocean was going to be blue, the light through the window was going to be blue, that beautiful industrial car background was going to be more bluey. And I wanted to figure out how to fit that with the brown colors of the wood, the sand of Sasha, so that I could start to figure out how to make better color palettes. This was essentially my testing ground for that. Obviously, I also got to make the cats look a lot nicer, and I think Patch Kit in particular in that first illustration is just very cute, and I was incredibly proud. The industrial background, again, is forever my favorite. I liked drawing the car seat. I liked drawing the car window in the back of Patch Kit. It was nice to see. And generally speaking, what I ended up doing here is realizing that saturation is the big defining feature. If I can desaturate the blues and desaturate the oranges, the browns, the yellows, the teals, then I can make them work together despite their differences. I also learned that I can use shading to make it feel more cohesive, as long as the shading is a vibrant enough color that it stands out. So using that bright red magenta that's nothing like either of their color palettes helps to bring a warmth to the entire illustration. And also, ocean in the background. But I blurred that out to make sure that it wasn't our focus. The biggest challenge of this illustration, though, was of course that a prominent part of it is this human. I had to draw the boat captain in order to make this illustration work. And you can see how long I'm delaying it. I'm drawing even the second panel of Sasha before I dare touch that human. I don't draw humans very much, essentially only for these comic pages when I'm absolutely forced to. But basically, it's tricky for me. I've spent years at this point drawing cats, and actually some ponies before that, and plenty of backgrounds at this point, but very little humans because I have no interest in drawing humans most of the time. This is a tricky step for me. And basically what I ended up doing was focusing on the teaching example from the comic page, since the comic artist may not be experienced in drawing cats, but they were experienced in drawing people. So I could take some of their lessons about how anatomy worked, how the posing would work, and try to use my time to focus on stylization. How would I format his jacket? How would his hand reaching out look? He would be reaching out with 2 fingers to give Sasha some scritchies, like I do. He would be using his little floofy beard to cover up a bit of his jacket. His shoes would be this way. His jacket would be this way. He would have these buttonholes here to slot in. And just making sure that I made a nice color palette using both the blues and the browns from elsewhere in the illustration to make it look cohesive. And shading everywhere it needed shading, which is a lot. It's definitely not something I could do on my own yet, but it's passable, and I liked my attempt for this drawing. Sunrise. Here's another one where I was definitely more focused on the moment than on the actual drawing, but I knew for Moon Kitty's heart and mine that I was going to have to draw the moment where Hazeltail knocked over a true like trash can and got herself covered in garbage. Everyone's trying to help her out, except for Birchfall and Brackenfur, who were already looking ahead and did not notice. But this was another one where I researched everything that was happening. I learned about every moment in the illustration and what every cat was doing at the time, any expressions they were making, any details about the environment. I was starting to get really serious about that in a way that would define some of my later work through Omen of the Stars. But here I was mostly focused on the posing and the portrayal of the garbage because I don't know about you, I didn't just want to draw garbage. I didn't want to draw spoiled banana peels or thrown out food all over Hazeltail. So what I ended up doing instead was making a mound with various different brushes to resemble thrown out garbage and wood and dirt and metal. Any of that stuff that I could make work as part of this trash pile, I was going to. And of course, with the city curb, I get to have just a taste of my lovely industrial backgrounds. But for right now, it's just... it is what it is. You can see here, I was still trying to figure out how to make color palettes work when I had already designed these characters. With Patch Kit, I was able to design him, and even the boat captain, to match the illustration I was already working on. But in the case here, I already know what Hazeltail looks like. I know what Lineblaze looks like, what Hollyleaf looks like, what Brackenfur, Brambleclaw, Birchfall look like. I had designed all of them. And I was having trouble getting out of the idea in my head that they don't always have to look like that. You're making a full illustration. You can alter Cat's designs, and especially Cat's colors, in order to fit the drawing you are currently working on. This is a lesson I would eventually take to heart, but here was just dodging around as I tried in vain to make these color palettes work the way they were. I did at least try to make the colors of the background work better. I chose a more yellow-based green with a duller colors. I made the yellow of the road match, but there's still some work to be done. And here was my last Sasha manga. This one is mostly focused on the warm shading tones of being inside a log. That is the world we were working in. An interesting thing I came across here that I don't even remember if I noticed at the time is that Mothwing is a bright yellow. Bright yellow. And having her here in this warm, dark color palette with everything else being such a different tone probably should have been a wake-up call of exactly what I needed to do to fix this problem I was having. But I don't think I got there. What I ended up doing instead was just really emphasizing the shading, since they are fully enclosed in a log anyway. And just made sure that everyone was dark, everyone was working as hard as they could to fit into this illustration. And then even applying some gradients with the dark and light tones I was going for across each of the panels to make them fade in a little better. This was a good idea on my part. But I don't think that it was necessarily enough to counteract how bright Mothwing is compared to every other character in the scene. I did also get to try some interesting angles, like here I'm trying out Leaf Pool's angle from Eclipse, I think, again. Basically just trying to figure out how to portray kitties who are mostly turned away from the camera, but you can barely see their muzzle. How do you portray that? How much of the face can you or should you show? And then also, how do you portray someone who is smiling but hurting? And it turns out the way you do that is with under eye curves and slight tilts to the eyebrows. There are ways that you can do micro emotions here, and I was starting to learn that. But overall, there's a lot of things here that they're definitely good steps. They were good tries. But the perspectives of the manes, the perspectives of the muzzles, the perspectives of the kitties looking up towards Sasha, particularly the kits, was just not working out the way I wanted it to. Even in the moment, I wasn't super happy with this, but I wasn't sure how to change it to make it work. What I will say I did like, which was probably the easiest part of the illustration, was the last panel, since it focused on an up-close shot of Sasha in a completely different shading from the rest of the piece. And I even added some red under her eyes to both give the tired and the angry sensations to her expression. She is absolutely going to make sure that Tigerstar never gets her hands on these kits. She has a determination and a literal fire in her eyes. So yeah, this one was nice. I would do things differently. Code of the Clans. Here was our posing episode. I knew that for this scene I wanted to portray that the patrons voted on was of the 5 original series apprentices having an impromptu training session with Whitestorm. We only hear Whitestorm's dialogue as part of this story, but we can infer from his language what everyone else is doing, and I took meticulous notes on it to make sure I knew. Whitestorm is bemused more than anything at Dustpaw trying to shove him aside. Ravenpaw is scared out of his mind. Greypaw is yawning. Sandpaw is currently sneezing on the sand as she was trying to inhale a big whiff of the scent in line with her overachiever energy, and accidentally inhaled some sand instead. Anyway, everyone is doing an awful lot of character acting in this piece. The original story is so stinking cute, and I encourage you to go reread it if you have the time. But basically, I was more focused on portraying the cuteness of this scene and all of the lovely bits of character that were shoved into it, more than I was on any illustrative details. But because I was working on character acting, I also got to work on some posing. I hadn't done this pose of shoving a cat aside, especially from this back quarter angle, ever before, and it sort of works. It works well enough. there's a lot of stuff I would change, like most of these. But it's definitely a good step where I was trying to do things that I hadn't done before. Firestar doing a standing angle, almost identical to that original fire and ice pose that I hated so much, but it's definitely improved here. His butt is not at the same level of his face. Figuring out how to portray a cat sneezing, which is more of a motion thing, was interesting. I ended up looking at a bunch of videos of cat sneezing in slow motion and doing my best to mimic them, and using a lot more interesting brushes to frame the sand and the shading, dappled sunlight through the trees. Yeah, it was nice. Bluestar's Prophecy. Oh boy. So this one I did over Christmas break, as you can see. And I was essentially sat there for 3 to 4 days straight, just drawing each and every one of these cats. I don't know in the end, I haven't counted it out, if this is the most cats I've ever drawn in a single illustration. But it's close. I drew an awful lot of cats here. Most of them are in back-facing positions, and almost all of them are sitting, which eased my work just a little bit, since you have to draw less of the cat that way. But it was also interesting for posing, because I hadn't designed most of these characters at all, let alone from the back. So I had to do an awful lot of on-the-spot designing with some mock-ups. And for the characters I did already know the designs of, most of them were actually pretty small details that actually got to be in frame. A lot of them I actually ended up being able to design based on family members that I had designed before. And all of them have been mostly fine. Like, I don't hate any of these designs, but I would need to see what they look like from the front to actually make a determination of whether or not I want to keep them. And I haven't done most of these cats as headshots yet, because the Bluestar's Prophecy cast does not come up very much in my discussions. What I will say is that I really, really appreciated the fun of being able to design all of these cats on the spot, so many in rapid succession. And I really should have... Dappled Pelt actually was designed right here. And Sunstar as well, yeah. So some designs have carried over into the future and other parts of this video, but mostly it was just about designing an incredibly large cast in a very short period of time. I had to look up most of the designs for these cats. I do have aphantasia, if you're unaware of what that is. It basically means that I can't see in my head. When I'm imagining, I only imagine audible notes of what I'm seeing, or potentially some smells or sensory details, but not any visuals. I also don't see in my dreams, which I'm aware is not universal across all people who have aphantasia, but it happens to be true with me. What it means, though, is that up until I draw these cats and have them in front of me to look at, I couldn't tell you what any of them look like. I don't read the books and picture them. I don't come in with preconceived notions of their designs. I forget most details of what anything looks like ever. So being forced to draw a full cast at once actually gave me a good appreciation of what they look like, what this cast looks like in the books. And it did also give me a chance to draw Crookedjaw, which was interesting. I needed to fix his design for later. I think I went too subtle on the wound here, but I will do that in a later illustration. We'll get to that. The one other detail to note here is that Bluestar's Prophecy, this big gathering, the Fortress Rock, the high rock, is actually in the center of the clearing, not at the edge, so cats fully surround it for a meeting, which I knew, but for the sake of this illustration I decided to ignore, because I was already drawing enough cats. and I didn't want to also draw all of ShadowClan and WindClan on the other side. But just, imagine they're over there somewhere. I was exhausted by the end of this, and I don't want to say I was being lazy, because I was clearly not by committing myself to this drawing in the first place, but I was being reasonable with my boundaries of how much I could actually get done before I had to stop working. At least I got to draw the 4 leaders. Also, because this is a night scene, and because I was designing all of them on the spot, I didn't really have a way of making their palettes come together cohesively from the beginning. But I did do my best to mitigate this with the shading, and with every cat having a blue cast all over them to make sure that where it is nighttime, we have a cool blue tint to everything. It was a step in the right direction, but I think with all of the cool and neutral tones on the left, and all of the bright ginger yellow tones on the right, it's not an especially balanced piece. But now we are moving on to the Fourth Apprentice, starting Omen of the Stars, and at this point it may come to your attention that we're, an hour and a half into this video, and there is still an awful lot to go, considering that we have done 3 of the 4 arcs that I have covered on this channel. This is partially because, as I went along, my illustrations got more and more detailed with each time, which I guess I probably should have expected going in, considering I was specifically trying to improve with each iteration. But it definitely was a death of 1,000 cuts situation. It came on slow, but powerful, which we will get to a lot later. The base is that you'll definitely start to see these speed paints take up more time per speed paint as we're going on, despite my speeding them up even more each time. For the Fourth Apprentice, I knew that I wanted to do the scene of Thornclaw and Lineblaze saving Rainstorm, partially because it's a really wonderfully written comedic scene that ties into the overall narrative and environmental issues in the book, but also because it had some really interesting poses happening around it that I wanted to try out. I wanted to see how I could draw mud as part of the environment as well as on a cat, and I had already made a design for Rainstorm for use in my Paws of Stars video, I'm pretty sure. And I wanted to draw the little fella. I really, really like Rainstorm. But my invented version of him in my head. I also got a chance here to draw Ivypool and Dovewing as their brand new apprentice versions, which gave me a chance to work out what their full bodies would look like. At a young scale at least, and also got me used to drawing them on a more consistent basis, since throughout Omen of the Stars I would definitely need to draw these two a lot. But I basically just got to draw my Thornboy, got to draw Lionblaze. I was finally, at this point, starting to make some peace with drawing tabbies. It's still not my favorite. They're a very long, tedious pattern to get down. And a lot of tabby patterns can quickly become too busy looking or too blank if you're not careful. But there were definitely ways around it, and I was trying out various different techniques in here to make the tabby stripes unique. I'd still like to keep experimenting with that. It's one of the things that I don't think I have fully down yet. The background here is probably the least interesting part of it, but it got the job done. We got a lot of stuff in here. And now we are on to more mangas, but this time it's the Ravenpaw ones, Ravenpaw and Barley. This one I knew was going to be a fun one to draw just because of the environments. The top 2 panels are of course taking place outside on the roof of the barn, which we knew was going to be a snow-coated barn, and that he was going to get his tongue stuck to a frozen, sort of a river, I'm forgetting the word, but the channel of water leading down the drain pipe. And that meant that I was going to get to draw snow and ice. things I did not do much before, so I was learning on the spot a little bit. I also did not know necessarily how to draw a tongue this long, but I was trying to figure out how far it would stretch and how thin it would get, how to line up the expression appropriately, and how to make the environment look like they were, in fact, using a gutter with water in it rather than just using a plane of ice. I basically did that by putting a full layer under it where I marked out some gray paneling with some lines in the middle for the industrial look, and then put a mostly opaque but somewhat not layer of ice over that. And then, of course, on the inside, you have the whole barn set up. You have this very nice contrast between that icy cool out the window look and the inside, which is all warm colors and dimly lit with beautiful warm shades for the wood paneling and the hay. Barley is in his red shading, while Ravenpaw is transitioning from his cool blue shading on his back end to his warm shading on his front. And then, of course, the hay itself, which is a thing I had only really tried drawing before for the sunset drawing, but this was definitely going to be in a very different version, and I liked the amount of detail that I was able to add to this version of the hay compared to the previous. Basically, it came down to adding a bunch of brushes in different configurations to make sure that it stood out as definitively hay with a lot of different particles inside. And generally speaking, with these two, they always had very cute expressions to play with. Ravenpaw and Barley getting to tease each other was just always very fun to see. And I really enjoyed drawing it. The last two panels were nothing special, all told, but it was nice to do some little interactions after this, and I really genuinely like the scene work on the top. In particular, Ravenpaw's expression as he plops that mouse down on the floor and then looks back at Barley. Absolutely priceless, and I enjoyed being able to adapt that into my style. I should also note, one thing I was also doing with the comics by this point is trying to enhance the background in some way rather than making it a white. And in this case, I did a gradient of the snow-coated background into the barn, as you can see here, just to make it fade in a little better. Speaking of fading, we have Fading Echoes, which opens with a whole bunch of flashing, yes, because we had an awful lot of cats here. For a good long while, this was probably the most ambitious piece I ever committed to, because I wanted, despite my general rule of trying to pick an underrated moment, to choose the moment where Jayfeather orders Leafpool to help him with Briarlight, despite his reservations about her, despite the fact that she has stepped back from being a medicine cat. This is a situation more important than any of their personal baggage, and he needs her help. So he is ordering her to do that in this emergency situation. I find that particular moment to be extremely powerful, and it was definitely one I wanted to get across appropriately. But part of conveying that is also showing the emergency situation they are in. This would not be as powerful of an illustration if I zoomed in only on Jayfeather, Briarlight, and Leafpool. I needed the fallen tree in the background. I needed Briarlight's family looking over her and, well, Briarpaw's family looking over her and being worried, trying to stand back and seeing how much or if they can help. I needed Bumblepaw leaning frantically on his mother as he tried to figure out if he would even have a sister in the morning. I needed Briarpaw frantically looking to her father for support and looking in on her sister. This is a shattered family. And it's not even only this, because in the background we have Mousefur and Purdy grieving over Longtail. We have Lionblaze trying to figure out what he can do, and Firestar looking over his destroyed camp, trying to figure out the best option and calm down his erratic clanmates. It's a lot. There's a lot going on in this moment that needs to all be there in order to convey the emergency. And that meant that I had to do a lot of research for this moment to see everyone who was there, everything that they were doing, every piece of it. And I also finally needed to truly design the ThunderClan camp so I could show the extent of the damage that was going on here. This meant that I needed to design, by myself and not with the aid of a comic, the most elaborate tree I had drawn thus far, and put that atop a set of 3 separate dens. We have the nursery on the left, which Whitewing was coming out of as she was viewing the tree. We have the Warrior's Den, or Elder's Den. I believe it was the Elder's Den that I decided at the top that a bunch of warriors' tails are sticking out of as they were looking through it and trying to figure out what even in there is salvageable, if there's anything, or if there are any things that we could use to help the survivors. There are a net of 5 cats who were asked to quote-unquote patrol in there, though I don't think that works as a explanation anymore. And then over on the right, we of course have Lionblaze and Firestar, who are trying to work through this the best they can, as they're leading up to the Elder's Den. And all of this makes up ThunderClan's camp, with the different cats of different sizes, different levels of detail. This was a massive piece. It was it was an awful lot of work, and I essentially needed to fully draw out every part of it with sufficient detail, and fully color all of the lines, not just those in the background. I used different brushes to render out the leaves of the tree, and the different shading patterns to render out the trunk. I needed this to be a focal point rather than most of my trees being just in the background. And I needed the dens themselves to be detailed enough that you could see this as a living world that matters and that ThunderClan has worked hard on for a long time. The gravity of this situation comes through in the details, so I really did need to work an awfully long time on just this background, and the sketch was even longer than that. You can see me just trying out a whole bunch of different brushes and shading patterns as I was trying to figure out every little bit of how this territory works, how this clan has built up their dens, and how they've gotten used to living here. And I drew that all out because I wasn't sure in the end exactly what would be covered by the tree. But the background, just by itself, is already very detailed. And it's been the base that I've used to figure out what ThunderClan looks like in every piece since. Back to the comics. This one was definitely one I took a step back on after the amount of effort I put into Fading Echoes. It just so happened this way because the patrons decided on a relatively simple page compared to previous ones. This one is basically just Barley and Ravenpaw coming across Crooked in the gathering area, right under the Great Rock. And it's, it's a cute little character building scene, but it didn't require a whole lot of effort in posing or environments on my end. Most of the broad elements are there for you, and they're really just in a field with some rocks and a couple trees. So there wasn't a whole lot that I needed to do that was groundbreaking here, which was absolutely fine by me. Because, again, I had spent, I want to say the better part of a week on Fading Echoes, just grinding away at it and eating into some of my time for the next videos while I was trying to finish it up. So being able to take a little bit of a lighter weight on this one was more than welcome. Besides, Crooked is cute. It's really nice to be able to just add in those flowers for some brightness, do a very easy set of backgrounds, and know that anything will very easily blend in with these 3 cats that are all neutral colors, all blacks and whites, and technically Crooked is a very, very dark and very dull blue, but again, that works very easily with the sky, with the grass. This is a very, very easy piece to work the color palettes out for, basically. And that gave me more time to just focus on the details, give a little flower decoration here and there, make the expressions really cute, and just use everything I had learned in this similar experience as before, knowing that I would be able to expand myself more later. But for right now, Really, the only difficult thing was that one front paw of Ravenpaw's, because trying to figure out exactly what angle it would be at as he was stepping was just the one challenge in here. Most of it was pretty squarely in my comfort zone at this point. It's still cute, though. And I do think the flowers add a nice touch. This was one of the few cases where I had more to say about the book than I did about the drawing, because, well, it's just pretty normal for me at this point. I did start using better techniques to add the shading to any of the grass that I was putting on the cats, in front of the cat's paws, but that would be the only real thing that was improved. Next, we have Battles of the Clans. Again, a relatively simple one, but not by my choice necessarily. The thing about Battles of the Clans is that, similar to most of the field guides, it's a bunch of little short stories. And the one that was picked here, for how cute it is, and I agree on that, was Sparrowpaw from Skyclan teaching Clovertail about the brand new cool move he's just learned, the Sky Jump. And Clovertail is, happy to hear about it, but not so happy that Sparrowpaw's vibrant, loud, lots of movement demonstration has been waking her kits, despite her numerous requests for him to lower the volume. It is an extremely sweet and funny scene. Again, if you can read Battles of the Clans, I genuinely encourage you to. All of those stories in here are fun as heck. But in the meantime, I had this little scene to draw, which basically just includes 5 cats. I know they're in a den, and only one of the kittens is awake, the other 2 have their backs turned. So it wasn't going to be a super lengthy piece. What I did end up doing for this was trying to figure out some of the Skyclan designs that I didn't previously have. Mostly the 3 kits I just needed to figure out on the spot, which was okay for the back end, especially since these 3 have pretty basic designs. The other thing I was doing here was adding 2 layers of shading, since I knew that their body parts would be shading their own bodies in places, but also their only light source was going to be the outside of the den. And then for the back wall, I ended up trying some new techniques to emphasize the cracks in the rock. But other than that, pretty simple. What was not so simple was my choice for the Skyclan's Destiny poster. The moment picked by the patrons for this one was the race that Skyclan did as they went up the tree and brought a feather from each of their teams. The 2 teams basically worked together in different plans to get a feather to the top of the tree as soon as possible. They could work together all on the single feather, or they could break up and make themselves distractions or force other cats off of the tree. This one took a lot of research to start, and even when I had done all of the research and figured out exactly who was there and where every cat was, which teams they were on and what they were doing in this moment, I also had to design a lot of these cats, because most of them I didn't have designs for before. This was a lot of Skyclan. And then after that, we have this massive tree in the middle. In addition to the, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 cats, I want to say. This is the most detailed tree I had ever done. After I pushed myself on Fading Echoes, I decided that I wanted to do a little more work with the branches of the tree rather than the leaves. And I certainly did. I did the branches of the tree in all twisting patterns, figured out that the things closest to the camera should be the darkest, furthest away should be the lightest, and then tried out various brushes for the front and backs of the leaves, back layers, and added shading to them. I even did something I had never done before, where I started with the leaf brush and then outlined that selection in order to make sure that the leaves were the main focus rather than my personal outlines. It made for a much more natural finish. I did something similar for the bushes, and then made the rest of the trees more simplistic in nature. This is also, by the way, where I discovered a grass brush and various other brushes that I could use to fade out some more trees in the background to make this look more like a forest. Whew, that whole thing, just the background, I believe took an entire day on its own. But then I also had each of these cats to do. Especially since all of these cats were going to be such tiny, tiny pieces of the illustration. I also obviously had them zoomed in while I was working, but you can't see them very well when you zoom out for the full speed paint. I knew this going in, so I knew I would need them to fade into the background. This meant colored line art again, for all of the cats. But it also meant that I was going to have to figure out a way to blend them together. Now, for this particular illustration, because we had so many color palettes going on here, so many brand new and different designs, I wasn't entirely sure at this moment how much it was going to fade together. Maybe all of the saturation, especially against this nice, solid green background, would stand out equally across the board, or maybe it wouldn't. I was going sort of on the fly as I was starting, but my main priority in this moment was just getting all of these different designs down. You can see, even as I was doing the mock-ups, that I was trying to make most of them unique in some way, and if they were family members, I was trying to make them connected. For most of the kitty pets in particular, I wanted to also design out their collars so that you could see who here is a daylight warrior, who here is still wearing their collar. There was a lot to this. You can't even really see it from this distance, but even when I start working on the feathers, that feather on its own I spent a, solid 5 minutes on, despite how tiny and simple it is. And each of the little kitties who are either helping each other or fighting each other, who have fallen down or poking behind a branch or are climbing up a tree, each and every one of those took, I'd say, a solid hour to complete, to my level of quality. I say that as if I'm like the height of quality. To a height of quality that I was willing to let go. All of these definitely took an awful lot of time. And for some of them, I was actually on a call with friends as I was doing this, because I was running out of time and needed some motivation. So I sometimes got some help from them on picking out an eye color or a collar color. You can see I actually changed the center cat's collar to green. Frecklepaw, sorry, is heading up that tree with all of her markings, her beautiful little feather, with its very, very intricate shading for how tiny it is. And then Leafstar, who is doing a very different pose than I had ever tried before. Generally speaking, I hadn't done any cats climbing before today, so this was a new experience for me. And I wanted to do it justice. This is a very beloved scene to me. I think it's one of the most unique activities that the clans have ever tried. So I definitely wanted to portray it well, especially because I knew how long this video was going to be. I had an awful lot to say about Skyclan's destiny. I may not have loved everything about that book, but I definitely had a lot to say about it, and I did like this scene. The process of drawing it was definitely an awful lot of work, but I really, really like looking at this one in the end. I love how it came out. And my only wish is that I had done a bit more work in the end, if I had time or motivation, to blend in some of the cats at the bottom here, especially with Blazefire and Billystorm in the bottom left. I think they're a little too vibrant to fit in with the rest of the drawing. But generally speaking, I do enjoy it. I enjoy it a lot. And now we come to our last Ravenpaw manga, The Heart of a Warrior. This one is definitely picked for a good reason. It was picked by the patrons because it is a really sweet moment of the entire clan coming to say goodbye to Ravenpaw and Barley and thanking them for all of their help. This is the moment where they really discover how much they are loved and welcomed as a part of this community, despite not living here permanently. And it is incredibly sweet, but it is not... It's not my favorite drawing in the end, and most of that does come down to color. This is a tipping point, I'll say. because it was here where I realized that if I just kept every cat the colors that I wanted them to be, based on their profiles, based on the designs I had made for them, I couldn't find a way to make myself like the overall composition. This particular drawing doesn't include a whole lot of foliage or background. It doesn't include a lot of specific shading. It's not a night scene. There's nothing that forces it to look a certain way, or that forces all of the cats to look a certain way. What you're looking at is basically a group of cats, and there's very little to distract you from that, which would generally be a bonus. It means that I don't have to design a whole lot of background, but it does mean that there's nothing to distract you from this set of clashing colors, which was becoming an actual problem for me. It prevented me from really liking how this piece turned out, even back then. And I was trying any way I knew how to figure out what to do about that. How could I change it? Which I will start trying out, and I will be applying in the next few drawings. But as I was working on this one specifically, with every cat I added, I just couldn't help feeling like it was worsening the piece. That the cats I was adding just didn't fit in together, or that Barley and Ravenpaw especially, who are the most neutral designs, they're black and white and don't have a whole lot of flashy markings. It felt like they, even as the center of the piece, were somehow fading into the background. As I was finishing up this piece at the very, very end, which we will see eventually, I actually tried a bunch of masking over them, masking over the other cats, trying to force it into working, force these cats to pop out. But it just wasn't working in the same way it did in the original comic. In the way it did in black and white, basically. This is a bit of a sad day, but honestly, it's important to note that not every time you do an art piece, you'll like what comes out the other end. You might not be happy with every single thing you produce, but it's still important to draw it. This was a massive learning experience for me. It showed me the crutches that I'd been using to avoid noticing this problem for the last many, many illustrations, and showed me why I had to be more creative and think of new ways to solve it now. Basically, I needed to start learning about color theory in a greater way than I had before. I obviously know about complementary colors, analogous, tricolors. I know all of the different color paths and how hue and saturation work. But I didn't know how to apply that to designs that I had already created, how to make casts of existing characters work together in an illustration. And that was something I was going to have to experiment with. For now, though, I do really, really like Sorreltail. Most of these cats on their own, I was actually really happy with. Sorreltail in particular, or Sorrelpaw in this day, is just really darn cute. I love Cinderpelt, and this is, in my mind, my redemption for the poor old Cinderpelt in the TNP era. The New Prophecy, if you weren't aware. It's really, really jarring to say how much I love a lot of these individual cats, and then to be forced to look back at the whole and not like it. It was really demoralizing in the moment. Firestar in particular, I knew even as I was drawing it was going to be a problem because he's such a blinding, blinding orange that he instantly becomes the focal point of anything you put him in, especially once you add that colored line art. I even decided not to add colored line art to Ravenpaw and Barley to make sure they would stand out at least a little bit, but there was just nothing I could do. I couldn't lower the opacity of the rest of the cast, that wouldn't make sense. I couldn't just make a big cast over all of them, I couldn't add a bunch of blue. It wouldn't be coming from anywhere, they're just sitting in the ThunderClan camp. Anything I could think of in the moment just felt like it wouldn't apply to the scene that I was drawing, and I couldn't figure out how to escape it. Cloudtail's in the back. Again, I love Cloudtail. I love how Cloudtail came out. I think his floofy tiny little mane from Princess and his chubbier body and physique, I think his joyful expression, it's all great. I love this little man. I love Longtail beneath him. I love Greystripe for once. I love Brightheart next to him in particular. I think this was a lovely drawing of her, and I enjoy being able to see her just smiling there happily as a full illustration this time. But she has bright orange spots that just add to the existing problem. What I really ended up needing to do was go off and try different things in other illustrations to make this work. Because I was finishing this one, and I was determined to do so at this point. But with each cat I drew, I got more and more dejected about it. It felt bad to continue. Drawing Fern Cloud took about twice as long as drawing Longtail did, because by this point I really wasn't feeling happy about the drawing at all. And when you're not feeling good about something, when you think you're going to fail it, it's really hard to keep going. Not just in art, but in general. The thing is, though, that in order to learn anything, you are going to have to fail something. Not everything you draw, not every math problem you solve, not every day of work you have is going to go perfectly. You're not going to improve upon every day with every day you have. But you're going to need to keep trying. You're going to need to look at your failures and not beat yourself up for them, which is definitely easier said than done. But in order to grow from them, you're going to need to be able to look at them and say, where do I need to start learning? What areas do I need to start asking for help in? Where do I need to start seeking out resources to learn from? Where do I need to start experimenting and set aside time for that experimentation? Obviously, all of these are easier said than done, but it is a necessary step in any learning process. At the very least, I did enjoy doing this foliage background. I made it as dull as possible to avoid overshadowing Raven Pond Barley, but I don't think I did a great job. As you can see, I was adding in the casts for the other cats, a bunch of shading, but it's certainly not my favorite. Night Whispers was my shift. This was the big step where I decided to start doing thumbnailing. This is where you make a whole bunch of tiny little drawings of possible compositions for your illustration. And here I decided I wanted to work on two things. Because I was just going to be drawing 3 characters, Lionblaze, Cinderheart, looking at the tunnel where Hollyleaf died, and then a facsimile of Hollyleaf somewhere floating above in Lionblaze's imagination. Because it was going to be such a simple idea, I wanted to make sure that I focused on the technical skills in this place, that I gave myself time to experiment. And the places I did that were in perspective and in color. First, you can see me playing with perspective. This is actually where I had my first time trying a perspective ruler in Clip Studio, but I'll be honest, I'm still not a master in those. They are very confusing, but I will master them eventually, given me enough time. What I will say is that they help a lot in figuring out where the general sightline should be and how your cats should fit into it, how your environment should fit into it, and making sure that ideally, it looks in this piece like you're looking up from what is effectively Hollyleaf's grave, according to Lionblaze. This was the first step of it, making me enjoy the line art so that I was willing to spend more time on the rest. The second was making sure that I did base coats for all 3 of the characters first, with the line art, and nothing else. I wanted to work out the entire background and see which colors we were going to have before I decided on what the rest of the characters were going to look like. This was a winter scene, so I wanted to add in some thorn bushes, some snow on the trees, paw prints in the snow, and you can't actually really tell in this, but I was individually filling in every single thorn with the beige color because the fill bucket was not working for me, and it took more time than I wanted it to. Each of the trees going backwards had to be lighter and lighter, and eventually the sky had to be dull enough to not clash. And then I started doing Lionblaze. I forcefully changed the entire color of his pelt to dull it out and make it look better with the scene, and then I cooled it down even further with the shading. I did something similar with Cinderpelt, but I didn't have to change her as much because she's already a relatively cool and grey cat. Hollyleaf, also here, is not her normal design, but similar to Secrets of the Clans, I went with an exaggerated caricature of her. She's much rounder in her curves, she has a warmer pinkish tone to her black. This is the way Lionblaze would see her. And both conceptually and technically, I really liked this piece. This was a success. So similarly, following that trend in Sign of the Moon, I started up with my next set of thumbnails. This time I knew I would be drawing Dovepaw and Ivypaw's warrior ceremony, where Spiderleg speaks up to say that actually, he thinks that they did a fantastic job and deserve to be warriors, despite the fact that Dovepaw didn't catch anything. It is a really nice moment, one I care a lot about, and I knew that starting out, I was going to need to mock up some colors for the entire illustration. Similar to the Ravenpaw mangas, this one had an awful lot of characters with a lot of different colors. But as you saw, what I ended up doing was splashing out a broad strokes version of the entire background, along with the entire cast, so that I could make very rudimentary blob versions of them and alter their colors from that. I actually posted that blob version to Patreon because it was very funny to look at on its own. But it was very helpful as well in helping me to define out the colors and make sure that I liked the palette and composition before I got into any of the line work. This was before I had committed to anything, before I couldn't go back and change it. I mean, you can go back and change the line work too. You can delete an entire cat and start over. But for my timeline specifically, that's rarely an option if I want to finish a video on time. Lionblaze, you can see, is much duller as in his previous incarnation. Most of the neutral colored cats, the Ice Clouds and Hazeltails of the world, are kept the same. Spiderleg was actually kept exactly the same in his color palette, and he is the only one in that regard. Because the distance in his color scheme and being able to distinctly pick out his bright black and his bright brown against it makes him a more focal point of the piece. I also used sightlines to accomplish this. Most of the cats around Spiderleg in both directions are looking at him or looking at Firestar. And because Firestar is away and is the secondary point of focus in this piece, ideally, your focus should be drawn to each of them. Our main characters, Dovepaw and Lionblaze, are both looking straight at Spiderleg with surprise, and most of the rest of them are either looking at Spiderleg with approval and happiness, or up at Firestar for the warrior ceremony, including, notably, Ivypool, who at this point does not care about her sister or her prowess, so this moment does not faze her at all. But off in the distance we do even get to have the medicine den, which was a nice thing to plot out. That and the High Rock were very fun to work into this piece and figure out the colors of. The whole thing here is just really thrilling for me because it was the application of all of the things that I had been trying to do for years and years at this point. This is the ThunderClan as I would like to see it. That is Firestar's den. This is Firestar standing atop the rock as he looks over his clan. This is Jayfeather, this is Briarlight, this is Poppyfrost and her kits. This is who they are and how they should look. And when you look at the piece overall, it's not jarring. The color palettes don't clash. It just looks vibrant, despite all of the different colors being used here. Despite the fact that it is a very saturated and colorful piece, as I tend to prefer, it's still not a monstrosity. The colors work. Which is really the first time I could say that in a piece that wasn't mostly neutral colors. I kept being, almost in contrast to the Ravenpaw manga, more excited with each and every cat that I drew and added in. Each piece of this that I was able to complete left me feeling happier, like I was really filling out this world and adding to the art rather than just adding a cat. I was making an illustration rather than making a collection of characters, and it was really relieving to be able to do this. I'm getting a little repetitive at this point, but I think you understand. Basically, this was a joyful moment for me in the art department, and I am incredibly happy to have been able to find the skills I did here. Also, the medicine den, very fun. Even with the leaves on top, the shading of the pink flowers, the little freckles I was able to add to the leaves and bushes. It was just really nice. Even the grass areas contrasting with the path and the sandy stone walls of the camp, it's all just really nice. And here we come to Crookedstar's promise. After such a high, it's not my favorite. And part of this comes down to how I ended up thumbnailing it. I think some of the other compositions would have worked better in the long run, but because I combined these two, it didn't end up looking as natural of a perspective as I wanted it to. One thing I did end up doing that I really liked for this piece was changing my Crookedstar design. I actually did that in another tab so that I could design Crookedstar's profile separately, but I wanted to really iron out what his wound looks like and what scarring it has done to his face, rather than just giving him an oblong smile. I also got to draw my favorite octet of kittens in RiverClan. Each and every one of them. This was not even my choice. My patrons decided on this game of hide-and-seek between the kittens being their picked-out moment from Crookedstar's promise, but I could not be more grateful to them in this case. RiverClan's camp is also a very different one to ThunderClan's. They have more heavy-hanging trees, more of the weeping willow type, and they specifically have floating dens, ones that are designed to be watertight and movable, which meant that I couldn't design them in the way I had designed other dens. They needed to be made of some sort of slick woven material that curled in on the bottom, and I was trying to figure out exactly how that worked as I went. Ottersplash is also here, actively working on said den while Leopardkit comes up and talks to her. This is technically a fusion of two different moments from the book, as Leopardkit wasn't asking for Ottersplash's help during the hide-and-seek, but rather during a request to go off and adventure outside of the camp. But because both of these moments involved all of the kittens together, and both were very cute, I just wanted to make sure that every kit had a special moment, basically. What it really comes down to, though, in this piece is that I don't think the perspective of the camp works with the perspective of Crookedstar and Black Kit out front. The other big problem being that I think I went too far in the direction I did in Sign of the Moon. I dulled out the colors too much for this, and RiverClan is supposed to be a pretty vibrant place. It has beautiful blue waters, it has vibrant green plants that are freshly watered all the time. I mean... Of all the clans, realistically, it should have the freshest and healthiest of the plants, especially the ones that are meant to go by the water. So realistically, I should have made the piece more vibrant, but I was only figuring that out as I went along, and playing with exactly how vibrant I wanted it to be on the spot was not working nearly as well. I should have probably done more tinkering in the blob color stage before I went into this coloring, but we live and learn. It's something I improve on later, and will continue to do so. At the very least, I did like the posing I gave for each of them. It really matched the energy of all of these kits that I have in my head. I got to characterize them in a way I don't normally, and take note of exactly what each and every one of them are doing. I have a video specifically about this octet of kittens, if you ever would like to watch it. But for now, that is mostly not what we're supposed to be talking about. Generally speaking, with all of the greenery in the back here, I was trying to apply my lessons, making the back trees less dark and less saturated than the ones in front, so they blended into the background. But I was having difficulty applying that to this perspective that I had already accidentally created. Because the front section of Crookedstar and Black Kit, is seemingly on a hill of some sort, it makes the rest of the camp look, like it's on a curve of some sort, like it's not a flat ground. It looks like none of these kits should actually be on these different planes that they should be closer together so they're standing on the same plane. I didn't end up doing that in the moment, so I could fill more of the canvas and show off more of these cats, but it did hurt the overall composition of the piece. in a way that I kind of regret on the way out. I do end up liking roughly how I left the dens, but I think I'd like to tinker with them more in the future to figure out exactly what was going on there. What are RiverClan's dens like? If you have any ideas, I'd love to hear them, because honestly, figuring out what each of the clan's camps looks like is a challenging task for me, and one I probably should figure out at some point or another. I started to redeem the piece for me a little when I added in the grass and the shading, but it's still not my favorite. And here we have the rescue. Yeah, so the Leafstar mangas, none of them are my absolute favorite, but I will say that there are a couple of things in this piece I really like. Ironically, none of the things I like are the actual cats in the piece. I think Leafstar's kits are pretty basically designed, and work fine for what they are, but they're not anything special, and they don't stand out as more cute than any of the stuff I had done before. What I do like about this piece is the way that I did, again, the industrial backgrounds, the lighting, and especially the background in the center panel. Which, for that panel, is, I guess, the foreground and not the background. I liked being able to draw in this blanket, figure out a cheap way to do the grid patterning for it in an easy and understandable way. I liked being able to figure out exactly where the sunlight would be coming in through the room and format Leafstar and the kits' shading around it. And, of course, I liked drawing in the shading in general, where I figured out how to use a tool to draw only in certain strips to make it look like it was filtering through the window panes. And then in the center panel, I really enjoyed just kind of the whole thing. Honestly, doing these backgrounds is starting to become one of my favorite pieces of any illustration, but being able to build out this home with all of its little elements, its windows and roof panelings, lanterns and shading, the little car beside it, and the bushes that bush up against the house, the little trees that are becoming more obviously a forest as I've learned my fundamentals and can figure out how to push some of those trees into the background. Even using different foliage brushes and patternings to put different trees into the background. We have some oak, some pine, some larch, and lovely shading all across the board. I really do like just staring at that second panel. And then of course we have our second human to contend with. This time an old lady. It was roughly about as challenging as the first one. You can actually see at some point I get so fed up with holding the hands, those hands holding the bowls, that I took a picture of myself holding a bowl and tried to figure out how that worked. It wasn't super obvious in the original comic panel either, so I couldn't even use that as reference. I still think I made the mistake of maybe giving her two left hands, but it's okay, you don't notice, right? And I also made her... well, I don't think I chose a specific race, but I gave her a darker skin tone because it fits in better with the composition, and this dull blue coat to help fit in. Basically, I wanted her to look cool and industrial in radical departure from Leafstar's chosen world of this bright hue and bright warm browns. I wanted it to feel like she's absolutely caring, she cares for you a lot, but you don't belong with her. You belong somewhere else, and Leafstar definitely stands apart from her in a way that I am happy with, I will say that. The last panel is essentially just a repetition of the first with different posing. I don't think I totally succeeded in the kitties looking straight up or fire kit just being folded in half poses, but I did my best and will use that as practice for later. It's something at the very least. Same grid pattern as previously for the bed, same lighting, and then it was just the background to do. Yep, it's fine. Now we have the Forgotten Warrior. This is one that I knew going in would have to be a very long drawing, a very long speed paint, because I had a lot to say about the book. This is one of my favorites in the series, so I knew that I was going to have a lot to say about it, and would therefore need a lot of drawing in the background to play while I was talking. The moment that was chosen, however, by the patrons was Hollyleaf leading Dovewing and Ivypool out of the tunnels, while Sol is teaching a WindClan patrol how to attack ThunderClan the next day or week in the near future. What I ended up focusing on, since there weren't going to be a whole lot of characters that I needed to render out, was how I was dealing with the perspective and detail of this tunnel. I had dealt with tunnels in the past, but mostly just by curving them off and doing a gradient shadow effect, which wasn't going to work here. I wanted the tunnel to bend in multiple ways to make sure that we could see our characters and see that the WindClan cats weren't straight down, ignoring them, but were off to the side where they could be missed if they didn't follow. I also wanted to add in some stalactites and stalagmites, mostly just to frame the piece. Also, you might notice that some of the kitties back there, Fur's pelt, not paw, and Whisker nose, not paw, along with Owl Nose and Weasel Fur, are all characters from Tempest Rift, the story I wrote with PETA and Lupa. So I definitely just self-indulged a little bit by using our co-opted designs and putting them in as part of this patrol. Only a couple of them were absolutely there. We don't know everyone who was in this patrol with Sol, but I couldn't help myself. Part of what I really enjoyed about this, and you can see during the color blobbing, is that I figured out how to push some of the tunnel into the background further by using blocks of color as pieces of the tunnel. Even though realistically, if this was a single stone wall, there wouldn't be any cel-shaded areas like this, because of my style and because I was going to be using cel shading in other places, placing the wall into different areas of cel shading to distinguish which areas were moving backwards further into the tunnel worked in showing the depth, and would just need to be accentuated with some extra softer shading and some extra details like the stalagmites or the kitties, and extra shading in general, in order to work well. Also, I got to try out some very fun poses for cats running. Basically for this, I just looked up a whole bunch of references and a couple of videos that I slow-motioned until I found a couple of running freeze-frame poses that I definitely wanted to use. I knew that I wanted Ivypool in a bit of a closed-off pose with all of her legs scrunched together so that you could see more of Dovewing when we put them on top of each other. And then the stalagmites are basically there to add the one and only bit of warmth in the piece, and also to hammer in that shading. The rocks are basically just there to show where the edges of the cave are, and again show that curvature as we're leading back further into the tunnels, and the stalactites are doing something similar. I got those reversed. Stalactites on the ceiling, stalagmites on the ground. Sometimes I forget too. But generally speaking, I just wanted to make sure that this cave had depth and detail, that each of the cats in it were shaded appropriately, and that especially all of the cats in the Sol Patrol were dulled and darkened profusely. They should be barely visible in the end, because the whole point is that they're so far into the cave that the cats barely noticed them, that Dovewing wouldn't have found them if she didn't have her super senses, and that the WindClan Patrol notably can't see the ThunderClan cats. The whole point of this moment is that they're getting away just barely in safety, and if any of the WindClan Patrol came close to spotting them, or looked like it would be stupid for them not to spot them, that wouldn't be an option. But also, cramming 6 cats into this tiny, tiny little space across the curved wall seemed daunting, and honestly may not have been worth it in the end, but I really wanted to include all of these cats. In the end, I do really like this piece. Beyond the Code, we are almost at the end. This is the most recent comic panel I have done, and if I was being completely fair, the end of the era would technically be with the 3rd Skyclan manga, and not with the end of The Last Hope, since they came out on the same day. However, I have ended up here because The Last Hope is a very, very detailed illustration in the way that I'm not sure the last comic page will be, but we'll see. This comic, however, was enlightening for me in a lot of ways. I put a lot more detail into it than I thought I would, and did something I have never done with any of the comic pages before, which is add in the dialogue. The reason I chose to do this in the moment is because the dialogue is the main point of this particular page. It's not just about two cats conversing, but about a lesson that they're teaching here. Leafstar is trying to help Soul and trying to teach him about the skills he can develop. And Soul has already decided that he can't possibly do it. He's already giving up because he's not good at everything instantly. Which, frankly, is such a profound lesson and happens to fit so well with this exact video that it feels predestined. The reality is that Soul absolutely could have become a Skyclan warrior if he had kept up the effort. Leafstar was there to teach him, and, you know, if Skyclan was a little less prejudiced against outsiders, that would be good too. But with her help, he was actually learning. In the very next page after this one, you can see him succeeding. But he has gotten into such an all-or-nothing mindset that he assumes he must either be a total failure or a total success. He doesn't appreciate the process of learning and growing in pieces, and understanding that there will always be new things to learn. Which is an extremely important skill for art as well, especially for me, because I did not do any art training really when I was younger, and have been doing it almost entirely through this series. There are a lot of things I'm doing now that I never would have dreamt of back in the day. All of this brightly colored shading on this brightly colored day, the colored line art, the cel-shaded highlights as well, the different backgrounds being added in against the intentions of the original comic, me inventing these backgrounds with this much detail just to frame the piece, using these lighting techniques, these combinations of cel and soft shading, these different perspectives, and finally getting that stupid 3/4 perspective where you can barely see the eye correct. Each of these things are challenges that I overcame in the long run. I was able to design a background based on what I knew of Skyclan and what I knew these characters were going to look like, so that everything would look cohesive. I was able to make sure that I composed the pieces and shifted around some of the characters so that they would be seen correctly and seen amongst the dialogue. I even turned on different layers and turned them off again, consistently throughout the sketch and the line art phase, to make sure that everything would turn out well and would look appropriate. In different places in the piece, I turned on different panels at once, so that I could see I was keeping the characters consistent. Even with Soul, who, like I've been complaining about, has these bright orange markings, I was able to make it fit in by taking into account the other colors in the piece. Leafstar has a warm brown color palette that's sort of a medium between Soul's bright orange and his dark brown. So this was going to work well, as long as I kept the rest of the piece warm as well, save for a few very dulled, cool accents, which we'll get to later in the more background-heavy panels. I used colored line art that differs in its color along his different sections of the body, which was a big challenge for me on tortoiseshells earlier. I also do something here where I change the opacity of that colored line art, depending on how much I want that line art to stick out on the cat. I use the vague anatomy of the original comic panel, but shift it to fit my own personal style and my understanding of the cat's anatomy and posing. I basically choose the pose based on what I actually want to convey in this comic. And as I do so, I change the dialogue, I change the other cat's poses. I make sure that everything is still fitting cohesively with the overall vision of the piece. I don't go one step at a time in the way I did originally, starting with Leafstar and just drawing her before moving on to someone else. I keep in mind the entire illustration as I work. And all of these are lessons that I built up. You've been able to see them. Each illustration has taught me something about where I need to grow, what I'm doing well, and what I can choose to research or improve on, go to my friends about, go online about to gather references or support materials. There are always ways to grow, especially in art where you have immense resources available to you everywhere. And it is entirely possible to improve. I'm certainly not a masterclass artist yet either, but I have grown a lot from where I was in the beginning. And that is due in no small part to my mindset that I've been able to develop about this craft. I care a lot about going into each new piece with something to learn, something to improve on, something to try out that I haven't done before. There are days where I will take it easy, especially if I've really pushed myself on a previous drawing. But most of the time, even those drawings will be able to teach me something about what to do going forward. And if nothing else, all of them are useful in helping me tell a story of both warriors and my overall journey through this series. Even the tabby stripes Leafstar has on this strange pose that warps and twists are more consistent than I've ever been able to do them before. Which is not something I would have been able to say earlier. I, again, really hate tabbies. But even after all that work, I still was willing and able to put in the work of designing a background, making it fit with the previous and making the shading fit in as well. And, for the first time, I added in the skyline, with a broad sunlight and some clouds overlooking it, in just enough cool hue to bring the eye just to Soul's face, which is bordering that sky. That's where you should be looking, roughly. And then, of course, we have the last piece, where there was only a little bit of foliage even included in the original background, with most of the piece being focused on the dialogue. Most of this background I ended up designing entirely on my own, with several different layers being included. And it was a riot, but we will get there. First, I had to draw some of the most complex poses I've done so far, because Soul was flapping about like a madman as he was trying to jump appropriately, and Leafstar was doing a much more clean and concise jump, with her legs all in perfect form. Conveying both of those things meant putting a lot of attention into the way that I was configuring each of those legs and making sure that they showed up correctly to anyone watching this speed paint, or just looking at the picture after the fact. The shading also got tricky to handle because of all that waving around, and I had to decide which parts were in front of other parts in order to be sure. Also, with the angle of the sun, certain parts of the body were going to be hit more or less based on how high they were up in the air. Leafstar's shading is overall weaker than Soul's is going to be, because she is more directly in the path of the sunlight. She's getting more light on her in general. In this case, though, the only thing I really had to contend with was whether or not I was going to include the motion lines. It's not something I usually include in my piece, but for this particular case, because of the point of the panel being the jump, it felt wrong not to. So what I ended up doing instead was having them, but fading into the background just a little bit, by making them colored line art with a glow around them. And then, of course, I also had to deal with the background. We have the rocks, which are designed like my normal rocks. We also have this weird fantasy plant, maybe a fern of some sort, and a bunch of little grasses that I added in. But we also, of course, have this whole background to do afterwards. Following all of these different little leaves, we have a bigger rock that I'm going to set up, and a cliff face, because we know Skyclan is made up of a variety of cliffs. This section I actually drew inspiration from by looking at surrounding comic panels and what generally Skyclan was looking like. We don't know exactly where Leafstar and Soul were training here, but if I could put in some cliffs and fade some more cliffs into the background with blurred tools without outlines, add in that little bit of sunlight to point us towards Leafstar this time, I was able to create something that I'm happy with. This is my favorite comic page to date, and I'm still really proud of it. Next, we have our second to last one. This is our first novella of the books, and I believe I accidentally said that Beyond the Code was our second to last. It was our third to last, oops. But basically, this one was going to be a picture of Hollyleaf hugging her poor little fox cub to soothe him to sleep, as he's gotten lost in the tunnels. I had already tried the tunnels once before, so with this incarnation of them, I really wanted to focus on making sure that that fox cub with its bright colors still fit into the background, that Hollyleaf actually fades into the background a little bit, as it says she does in the book, and that the tunnels themselves felt wider. Rather than being a single tunnel from one point to another, that it felt like a network that this fox could get lost in. This meant drawing several different paths leading off of each other, and several different little rocks jutting out. I added to the complexity of the rock structures as well, and in ways that I really ended up liking in the end. Generally speaking, I tried to do broad curves and then define those curves with extra support lines, which I would then shade to make them look more realistic. I added in a combination of cell and hard and soft shading so that I could define that pattern and make sure that the tunnels themselves faded into each other, and spent an awful lot of time figuring out how to make the midsection of the tunnel with these two big panels fade into the section right by Hollyleaf and the fox cub. Fallen Leaves being in the background was a no-brainer, as he looks in on and blatantly chooses not to participate in whatever is going on with this fox, and I ended up adding in a few different rocks and some more definition to that hallway, so it didn't look quite so empty. But otherwise, this was pretty simple, and I'm still really happy with it. What wasn't so simple was my last drawing. We have officially arrived. This is, without a doubt, the most complicated piece I have ever done, and I did it on a much higher resolution than I normally do, because what I knew I was effectively going to be doing was drawing 9 mini entire scenes, in addition to the big scene in the middle of Firestar's death. This was going to be complicated. I didn't quite realize going in how complicated, but this piece on the whole took 2 weeks of work alongside my other projects. And it took referencing various different cat poses and places before. This one here for Leaf Pool and Squirrel Flight was actually referencing a previous one from Cloudstar and Bird Flight, which I had done quite a while back at this point. I had my patrons vote on each of these moments for each of the virtues of Firestar's lives, but I wanted to make sure that this was the overall composition of the piece. Not just because I knew the video was going to be long and I needed a long drawing to accompany it, but because this is the end of an era. This is one that was going to mark the end of my time drawing Omen of the Stars, and I wanted it to be climactic in some way. I wanted it to be a summation of everything I had learned in drawing form. And in a lot of ways, it was. It was able to be that. There were a lot of times where I wanted to take more shortcuts in the end, because, again, this was taking a long time, but I wanted to do it justice. Firestar's shading around the scars to make sure it feels like those are bruised and freshly bloodied areas. The several layers of shading and lighting on both him and the scarred logs. The scarring to the grass around him and the rendering of the fire. This whole opening piece, on its own, took a solid few hours. And then we got into the smaller ones. With all of these pieces, they're probably going to look less detailed to you. That is unfortunately not something I was able to fix. On my end, they were much higher in resolution, of course, and this is actually a piece so detailed that I was able to make a poster out of it that I am planning to buy a copy of myself for future reference. But unfortunately, Clip Studio was not able to do speed paints in that high of a resolution, which I understand, and I also couldn't have screen recorded this like I did in the old days because my computer was already having a hard time dealing with just this drawing. Seriously, anytime I tried to save it, it would take a solid 30 seconds to do so. This was a big piece, and it only got bigger with each element I added. Between the posing here that I took inspiration from that first Into the Wild drawing to create, and the shading in the background using the pine trees and the techniques I had gained for how to draw foliage, the jumping that I had just learned about from the Leaf Star and Soul piece. Each element of this definitely showed what I had grown into. Then we have Yellowfang and Broken Star. Obviously, this was a very important moment, showcasing justice, of course, but it also here was a showcasing of my use of line art and of opacity. I had learned how to use different layers and different modes to make Broken Star with his shineless eyes fade away in parts while still being visible. I learned how to make the shading on the grass line up around them, and how to make the piece as a whole stand out. Then we have Mothwing and Jayfeather, this part of the piece being inspired by Starlight's drawing back in the day, because we were returning to the moon pool in almost the same scenery, with a few updates. I was of course zooming in and doing it from a different angle, and I chose to portray the waterfall in a slightly different way because of that angle. But overall, it is a rough approximation of that same scene. Both of the two were sitting, and the poses weren't anything special, but I was using the specific detail of everything around them and the shading I was using in the piece to make it feel like nighttime and a serene day. I also, very notably, changed the way the rocks worked because the original rocks bothered me. The way that the rocks changed in how they looked from the side of the moon pool to the rest of the paneling was just not my favorite. Then we have Briarlight's piece, which I would consider an upgrade of the one from, I don't actually even remember the book, but from Cinderheart falling off the tree as she tried to rescue Mousepaw. This is another cat hanging from a tree, but now I've learned how drawing trees works, and I've learned to look up references to help me with difficult poses. I even made sure to include a little Millie and Whitewing, who are looking at the hanging cat rather than the falling cat, and made sure that their perspectives were actually in line with Briarlight's, so it doesn't look like I warped the perspective halfway through the drawing. We then have Love. As I said, this one was a revisit to the posing from Cloudstar and Birdflight. But this time I wanted to make sure that Leafpool's head was going to be wrapping around Squirrelflight's, and vice versa, so that it looked like they were really hugging each other rather than just sitting next to each other. I wanted their tails to be almost wrapping around each other, but more going over each other than anything else. And I wanted to plot out the entire drawing ahead of time, so that I knew exactly which parts I was going to need to draw and which I would not. We then have Protection. This is not a callback to any specific other drawing, but it is an awful lot of posing work that I was not expecting to do previously. At best, I would say this is actually a callback to my Paws of Stars video, since I ended up having to draw an awful lot of the same characters. Brightheart, of course, along with Silverhawk and Featherstar, and Ferncloud, who is just there. And I also had to make a lot of mock-ups. What you could say is that this is a callback to the lesson I've learned to mock up any of the cat designs ahead of time for cats that I'll need to include in a drawing. Each of the kits in the nursery, save for Lilykit and Dewkit, were completely new to me. I had never drawn them before. So I made sure at the very beginning of this piece, before I even got here, to fill out exact diagrams of what each of them would look like. This way, when I got to them in the piece, it was seamless, and I could focus on making sure that their poses were accurate and pieces of them were sticking out from the nursery that needed to be, rather than on what they looked like in the middle of this wild array of colors. I used my foliage skills on the den and the lighting, made sure to iron out exactly what those nests look like, and then used the kit designs to fold into each other and make sure that each of them could be seen at least a little bit, despite their tiny, tiny sizes on this relatively large piece. Even despite all of these different colors, I made sure that the piece as a whole was still going to come out nicely, by using the lighting, shading, and casting to make the kits fade more into the background. Then we have the mentoring. This is probably best to call back to the Forgotten Warrior rather than the Hollyleaf story illustration, because of my specific choice of which tunnel to use. But generally speaking, this was an answer of how I draw cats from the back now, how I draw backlit shading, and how I am choosing to portray tunnel backgrounds as a whole. This was a lesson I had learned only recently and was beginning to apply more often, and I wanted to include it as part of this piece as soon as I figured out that Hollyleaf's mentoring was going to be the example for this trait. This is a big deal for me. Oh, I should also use this moment to mention, while she's still on screen, for all of the Dark Forest cats in this piece, I made their line art red and gave them a slightly red glow. It's barely noticeable from afar, but I know it's there. We then have Dovewing and Ivypool. This one is, I would argue, a callback to the Forgotten Warrior. Because it's a very small piece with just a couple of cats, but in a winter setting where I need to figure out how to make the shading match with it, and how to make the colors cohesive across the piece. Ivypool and Dovewing are of course cool colored in general, but I needed to make sure that their shading even pushed that further. The snow-coated ground and how I was going to render out these hills when the snow itself is pretty smooth, and the trees should realistically be much cooler than I portrayed them here, was a challenge that didn't even feel like as much of a challenge in the moment, because of the lessons I've learned. And finally, we have Midnight in Rock, representing nobility, certainty, and faith. This is 2 cats from the back, with very unique designs, one of whom is, not a cat. Very unique line art, overlooking a shore with a whole lot of detail, a forest far in the background, reflections on the water, how to figure out a perspective of a ledge overlooking something. This is honestly the culmination of an awful lot of different pieces. Crookedstar's Promise, my background work for the last Pause of Stars cover, the reflections calling back to the piece from Eclipse, and my attempts to put a rainbow in the water, and the shading itself being based on the warmth that needs to happen at this sunrise. It's really the perfect culmination of all of the skills that I've learned so far, and I would very much like to continue learning as I move into the future. This is the biggest piece I have ever done, by far, and I'm not about to forget it anytime soon. I really do hope you enjoy it. With all of these drawings complete, the question becomes, where do I go from here? Well, as I've said, I'm far from a master at art, and I still have plenty I would like to improve on. However, I do want to step back from this need I acquired to make each illustration better than the last. Even with the simplest moments, with the fewest cats, like the illustrations for Night Whispers and Hollyleaf Story, I've spent several days on them, researching, planning, seeking out references, and perfecting each detail until there's something I can be proud of. And more detailed ones, like the illustrations for Fading Echoes, Skyclan's Destiny, or Sign of the Moon, can take me a full week on their own, alongside my work schedule. I am very, very proud of where I landed for The Last Hope, though even that had some areas I would like to improve in. But that piece took me 2 weeks and would have thrown off my schedule completely if I hadn't planned for it. And let me be clear, I am proud of these illustrations. There's a reason I was able to talk about them for almost 3 hours. I am proud of how far I have come, and I would like to see how far I can go in the future. But at this point, I have to make a choice. I can either cap myself off on how complex I make these illustrations, or I can make fewer of these videos. This series has given me a deeper understanding of and appreciation for art than I have ever developed before, and I'm grateful to it for that. But my primary point going into this series was, and mostly still is, being able to talk about the books and show their change over time. With upwards of 100 books and more coming out each year, I don't think I could meet that objective if I slowed down on how often I release Trip Through Time videos. So I'm probably not going to make illustrations as detailed as The Last Hope was again, at least outside of very special occasions. What I can promise you is that I will not stop growing, and I don't want you to stop growing either. I want you to picture something you'd like to improve in. It could be school or work skills, getting into more or different exercises, learning a language or how to cook, or experimenting with animation, writing a book, or composing music. Unless it's something that you're building your career around, it's likely not something you can dedicate all of yourself to. You'll often hear to practice for just 5 minutes a day, and if you can, that is genuinely great. But some skills and some people need more intentional practice and working blocks to grow effectively, which might mean you have to practice for a couple hours every 2 weeks, or every month. Whatever time you can put in, if you make it consistent and thoughtful practice, you can and will improve. I was able to come as far as you've seen in 5 years of consistent, if not frequent, practice. Art was never a passion of mine before, and I still struggle with boredom or frustration during some drawing sessions. But I have always loved the products that come from realizing your creative expression, and with each lesson I've learned, I've grown to appreciate the craft of art as well. I am not a master, but I am an artist, and for now, that's enough improvement for me. Thank you all for watching, for years in the past and maybe years into the future. And always remember that, after you talk for 3 hours straight, you should probably drink some water.